In London, the mind itself became a battlefield. The year is shrouded in fog, the gas lamps flickering against walls that have witnessed both grandeur and despair. Within the antiseptic halls of Victorian hospitals, a quiet horror takes root, doctors boasting of calm and cure, armed with tools meant to sever thought itself. Lobotomy is whispered as salvation. Yet, beneath the white coats and polite announcements, something far darker unfolds. Minds are dulled, personalities erased, families left staring into hollow shells of their loved ones, and the city exhales a collective shiver. If you've ever wondered how science could turn mercy into terror, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from, because the story ahead will chill even the most rational mind. Victorian London was never the same. Streets thrummed with the quiet despair of those who had been healed, while society celebrated progress. The line between cure and cruelty blurred, and a city that once thrived on ambition now breathed under the cold, mechanical rhythm of lobotomy. This is a tale of ambition, hubris, and the horrifying cost of human experimentation, a nightmare etched into the very heart of the metropolis. The fog clung to the city like a patient that refused to breathe, seeping through the narrow streets, curling into every alleyway, and pressing against the doors of every household. London, in its gaslit splendor, seemed calm enough, but beneath the facades of brick and stone something restless stirred. It was the mind, they said, capricious, fragile, and in need of mastery. Doctors, scholars, and men of science had begun to speak of it as though it were a continent yet undiscovered, a place of maps unmarked, rivers uncharted, and dangers that only courage, intellect, and steel could confront. In the lecture halls and quiet consulting rooms, a new ambition bloomed: to cut away madness, to divide disorder from reason, to make the mind orderly and obedient to human will. It began with fascination. Learned gentlemen presented the brain as both mysterious and mechanical, a clockwork of nerves and fibers to be examined, manipulated, and ultimately controlled. They spoke of neurons as if they were lines on a ledger, and thoughts as objects to be categorized, measured, and, if necessary, removed. To Victorian ears, this sounded not only practical but morally righteous. If the poor, the hysterical, the unstable could be corrected, then society itself would benefit. The hospitals, once the site of palliative care and gentle observation, became laboratories of this belief. Every ward echoed with whispers of possibility, the gleam of instruments, and the faint, sweet smell of ether that floated from operating rooms to corridors like an invisible herald of power. The patients were not merely cases, they were territories to explore. Families arrived, trembling with hope and fear, handing over loved ones with the confidence born of deference to authority. Fathers, mothers, and siblings sat stiff-backed in chairs, gloved hands clutching one another, while surgeons in immaculate coats prepared their tools. There was the scalp, the trephine, the fine blade, and the promise of calmness, and always, above all else, the anesthetic, invisible and sweet-smelling, weaving through the air as a harbinger of submission. Every procedure was framed in polite precision, yet beneath that civility lurked uncertainty and a terror that none could voice aloud. In lectures, the men of science recounted stories of patients rendered docile, voices silenced, anxieties erased, personalities altered beyond recognition. They spoke clinically of measurements, of success and complication, never touching on the hollow that remained when a mind was made vacant. And yet, in the servants' corridors, in the streets that hummed with the ordinary noise of horse-drawn carriages and the murmur of commerce, Londoners noticed the difference. Faces appeared distant in the windows, eyes unblinking in the fog, and a certain dread settled over the city, unspoken but undeniable. It was a time of ambition, of intellect pressing against the unknown, yet the first rumblings of fear had begun. The mind, once an intimate refuge, had become a frontier, and London itself the laboratory. Gaslight illuminated the streets, casting shadows that seemed almost to whisper of what had been lost, while the scent of ether lingered, a reminder that progress was not without its price. And as the city slept under the chill of the night, a quiet unease threaded through every neighborhood, hinting that the promise of cure carried within it the seeds of nightmare. The streets of London were slick with mist, gas lamps casting trembling halos onto the cobbles, and the faint murmur of horse hooves echoing like distant pulses. Beyond the city's elegant facades and respectable houses, hospitals stood as silent monuments to both hope and dread. Their brick walls, cold and unyielding, contained a world apart, wards humming with whispered anxieties, corridors lined with polished instruments, and rooms where the air smelled faintly of carbolic, ether, and human unease. These institutions, presented to the public as havens of relief and comfort, concealed a different truth beneath the veneer of antiseptic civility. Within their walls, the promise of cure was spoken of in tones both reverent and assured. Surgeons, their coats gleaming in the gaslight, moved among the patients with the quiet authority of men convinced of their own infallibility. They measured pulses, examined pupils, and tapped on temples as though consulting a map only they could read. To the families who accompanied their loved ones, the hospitals were temples of salvation. Mothers clutched handkerchiefs embroidered with care, fathers straightened their collars, children sat trembling on stiff chairs, and all listened intently to the explanations of men who spoke of lobotomy as a moral duty, a scientific advance, a path to order and serenity. The language was clinical, the demeanor calm, yet beneath each word lay an unspoken truth. The mind could be lost, irreversibly, in the very act of healing. Operating rooms were prepared with meticulous care, tables polished until the steel reflected the pale faces of nurses and surgeons alike, instruments arranged with geometric precision, and the soft glow of lamps illuminating the room in a light both soothing and disquieting. The ether, sweet and almost alluring, filled the room with its invisible haze. Patients, sedated and trembling, were handed over to the hands of men whose confidence masked the uncertainty of the procedure. Every movement was choreographed, every incision planned, yet the results were unpredictable. In these rooms, the distinction between relief and ruin was as narrow as the blade that hovered over the temple. Meanwhile, in the hospital corridors, the city's ordinary noises were muffled by thick walls, yet the unease seeped through nonetheless. Servants and attendants spoke in hushed tones of the patients who wandered vacant-eyed, of those who screamed in the dead of night, and of the quiet despair that seemed to cling to the wards like a stubborn fog. Even the well-bred visitors could not entirely dismiss the odd tension in the air, the faint sound of weeping behind closed doors, the way the gas lamps trembled as though reflecting the uncertainty within. Every patient admitted carried with them not just illness but expectation, fear, and social weight. The hospitals promised relief from mental torment, yet they exacted a subtle toll on identity, memory, and the soul. Families left with hands cold and hearts heavy, knowing that even when the procedure was deemed a success, the person they knew might no longer reside within the body before them. And so, the hospitals of London stood, grand in facade, methodical in purpose, and quietly terrifying a city within the city, where the pursuit of progress brushed against the thin veil of human morality, and where the promise of cure carried a shadow that would lengthen with every passing year. The lamps in the surgical theatre glimmered weakly, their yellow light quivering against walls lined with instruments that gleamed like promises and threats alike. Outside, the fog clung to London in silken sheets, drifting through streets and alleys, pressing against windows as if the city itself held its breath. Inside, the surgeons spoke softly, voices low and deliberate, as though the walls themselves might overhear and report them. Every word was measured, every instruction precise, but beneath the clinical tones lingered something unspoken, a tremor of doubt, a shadow of fear. They were pioneers, men of science and intellect, yet each whisper carried the weight of what they were about to commit. The patients lay on tables, draped in sheets that smelled faintly of carbolic and something colder, something metallic that had seeped into the ether. Their eyes flickered, wide and uncertain, reflecting the gaslight like twin pools of apprehension. Nurses moved silently about them, hands steady but hearts quick, knowing that even a small misstep could transform procedure into tragedy. The surgeons leaned close, murmuring reassurances that blended the language of medicine with an almost religious cadence, calm, precise, moral. Yet within the soft syllables lurked a confession unspoken. They did not fully know the consequences, nor could they foresee the hollows they were about to carve into minds. Conversations in the theatre were coded, technical, full of terms that sounded like poetry to the untrained ear. Trephine, lobe, anterior, incision. Each syllable suggested control, mastery, and inevitability. Yet as the first blade touched skin, and the faint hum of ether filled the room, a different reality made itself known. Even the most learned could not entirely predict the mind's labyrinthine paths. Some patients lay still, eyes closed, as if drifting into a deep and dreamless sleep. Others twitched, gasped, or let out murmurs that betrayed fear beyond comprehension. And the surgeons, whispers flowing like ritual, continued with their work, their confidence a delicate veneer over mounting apprehension. Outside the operating theatre, the hospital corridors seemed unnervingly quiet, though every floor echoed with soft footsteps and the occasional murmur of a nurse checking on a patient. Visitors lingered in reception areas, drawn by the promise of relief, yet unaware of the subtleties unfolding within the walls. London, in its gaslit elegance, carried on, oblivious to the new horror taking root in its hospitals. Yet for those who had seen the procedure, even from a distance, unease settled like dust in the lungs, a sensation that lingered long after the encounter. By nightfall, the theatres were emptied, the instruments polished and returned to their racks. The surgeons retired to offices lined with medical texts and journals, whispering to one another over cups of lukewarm tea. They spoke of success, of measurable calm and compliance, but their whispers betrayed uncertainty. Did they cure the mind, or merely silence it? Were the patients improved, or had the essence of their personhood been excised? Each whisper carried the tension of knowledge and ignorance intertwined, a recognition that progress had its shadows, and that in the pursuit of mastery, the city itself might pay a terrible toll. And so, the surgeon's whispers persisted, a quiet chorus beneath the fog and gaslight, marking the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch through London's streets, its parlours, and its hearts. The mind, once a sanctuary, had become a field of experiment, and those who entered the theatre would never be entirely the same again. The waiting rooms of London's hospitals were hushed sanctuaries of anxiety, where polished wood and polished faces could not disguise the tension that coiled in the air. Mothers sat stiff-backed in carved chairs, gloved hands clutching lace handkerchiefs, while fathers adjusted collars and tapped fingers against the armrests in rhythm with their uneven hearts. Children, unaware of the full weight of the procedure to come, clung to their parents' skirts or sat silent, eyes wide and searching. The scent of carbolic mingled with the faint, sweet perfume of anxious visitors, creating an atmosphere that was both sterile and suffocating, a perfume of hope laced with dread. Through the fogged windows, the streets of London moved on, indifferent to the turmoil within. Servants scuttled in and out, carrying notes and refreshments, their expressions carefully neutral, betraying only the faintest trace of unease. Outside, gas lamps flickered in rhythm with the distant clatter of horse hooves, echoing like muted warnings against the stone walls. The city breathed, oblivious, yet the air inside was taut with expectation. Every visitor had come seeking relief, reassurance, a promise that the troubled mind of a loved one could be restored to order, silenced of its anxieties, rendered calm and obedient under the hands of men in white coats. Conversations were murmured, punctuated by the occasional cough or the rustle of a gown. "Do you think it will help?" a mother asked, her voice low, almost swallowed by the shadows. A father's response was clipped, measured, designed to calm both himself and his companion, though the tremor in his hand betrayed uncertainty. Other families spoke in whispered speculation, sharing rumors gleaned from newspapers or friends of friends, reports of astonishing recoveries, of patients made compliant, voices softened, desires stilled. They clung to these tales, desperate to believe in the miracle of progress, unaware that behind the polite assurances lay consequences unspoken and invisible, waiting to unravel the familiar bonds of love and identity. Occasionally, the door to the operating theatre would open, and a nurse or orderly would glide through, bearing news or leading a patient forward. The waiting room would hold its collective breath, eyes tracking the passage of bodies swathed in white sheets, hearts leaping with hope or sinking with fear. Some patients returned with eyes unfocused, their lips moving in soft murmurs that carried no meaning to the waiting family. Silence would descend once more, punctuated by the quiet scratching of a pen on a medical ledger or the distant clang of instruments being cleaned. Families sat rigid, straining to discern change in those who had gone in, uncertain whether the calm they sought had been achieved or if the essential spark of the individual had been stripped away. Time flowed strangely in these rooms. Minutes stretched like hours, and hours condensed to moments. The lamplight flickered across anxious faces, casting shadows that lengthened as the day waned. Visitors whispered prayers, shared soft confidences, or sat in oppressive quiet, each aware that the fate of a loved one rested on a procedure whose consequences could never fully be known. The waiting room became a crucible of anticipation, fear, and hope, the very air vibrating with unspoken tension. In this fragile interlude, London itself seemed to hold its breath, the fog pressing tighter against the walls, as if sensing the unfolding transformation within. Here, in these rooms of polished wood and anxious souls, the true cost of ambition and progress began to reveal itself, one patient at a time. In the shadowed sanctum of the hospital's surgical wing, instruments lay arranged with meticulous care, each gleaming edge reflecting the trembling gaslight like a whisper of promise and peril. Scalpels, trephines, forceps, and ivory-handled probes were set upon polished trays, their precise alignment a study in orderliness that belied the chaos they were designed to impose upon the mind. The air was faintly sweet with ether, a scent that wrapped itself around the steel and seeped into the walls, as if warning the unwary that the tools were not merely for healing, but for transformation of an irrevocable sort. The surgeons approached the instruments as men might approach relics, reverent and methodical. Each implement had a purpose, a name, a function so precise that its misuse could alter life irrevocably. The trephine, its circular edge honed to perfection, promised access to the inner workings of thought, while the delicate scalpels were instruments of selective intervention, designed to sever what was deemed dangerous or unruly. Every handle was polished, every blade sharpened, yet beneath the confident exterior lingered doubt, a silent acknowledgement that the mind, intricate and mercurial, might not yield as the manuals suggested. The instruments themselves seemed to hum with latent menace, a mechanical chorus attuned to both the surgeon's hand and the tremors of the human spirit. Nurses, gloves damp with carbolic, moved silently around the trays, adjusting positions, wiping surfaces, aligning the steel as though to appease some unseen force. Each tool carried a history of hope and fear, whispered in the pages of medical journals and lecture notes, celebrated as triumphs while masking the casualties, the blank faces and hollow stares of those who had passed through the theatre before. In their gleam lay the tension of possibility, Could they alleviate suffering or merely erase the essence of the patient? Visitors rarely saw these instruments. Families lingered in waiting rooms, voices hushed, hands wringing lace or linen, unaware of the subtle terror encoded into each object on the trays. Yet servants and attendants, familiar with the rhythms of the theatre, spoke in whispers of the uncanny precision, of tools that seemed almost alive, guided by hands that carried authority yet trembled with unease. It was said that even the smell of steel in the ether-laden air could cause fainting among the unprepared, a prelude to the disorientation that awaited the patient. Within the theatre, the surgeon's hands hovered over the trays as if conducting a symphony of steel and nerve. Fingers traced the curves of forceps, balanced scalpels between thumb and forefinger, and adjusted the trephine with care. Their eyes, pale and steady, betrayed a fascination mingled with apprehension. Each instrument was an extension of both intellect and ambition, a tool capable of salvation or devastation in equal measure. Even as they spoke softly to one another of technique and procedure, their words carried the unspoken truth that mastery over the mind was tentative, provisional, and fraught with peril. The instruments were placed, polished, and inspected again, their alignment absolute. Each represented a promise: relief, calm, order, but also the risk of irrevocable loss. London, beyond the walls of the theatre, pulsed unknowingly with life, commerce, and fog, yet inside, the stillness held a weight heavier than the city itself. Here, amid the gleaming steel and sweet ether, the first instruments of the lobotomy waited. They waited to carve, sever, and transform the very essence of those who would come under their influence, heralding a quiet nightmare that would creep from the theatres into the parlours, the streets, and the hearts of the metropolis. The operating theatre lay bathed in a trembling halo of gaslight, each flicker casting shadows that danced across whitewashed walls, instruments, and the pale faces of those who would wield them. The lamps, suspended from iron hooks, trembled with the draught that crept through the aged brick, and for a moment the room seemed alive, breathing, waiting, almost sentient. It was here, beneath this unsteady illumination, that the human mind would be laid bare to the precise yet unyielding hands of men who believed themselves arbiters of reason, arbiters of sanity. Patients were brought in on stretchers, their eyes wide and searching, as if they understood the gravity of the ritual before them even before consciousness failed them to ether. Their skin gleamed with a sheen of perspiration, hands fidgeting, muscles coiled tight with fear. Nurses and assistants moved silently around them, soft-spoken and careful, adjusting sheets, administering sedatives, and checking instruments. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and ether, a sweet, penetrating aroma that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the bones, dulling senses even as it heightened apprehension. Every breath was laden with anticipation, every heartbeat a subtle drum counting down to the irrevocable moment. The surgeons, in their immaculate coats, circled the table with deliberate precision. Their eyes, cold yet alert, surveyed the patient as one might examine a delicate mechanical device, yet beneath the practiced calm lurked an awareness of uncertainty. No manual could account for the vast complexity of human thought. No previous procedure could guarantee that personality, memory, or consciousness would survive the interference of scalpel and trephine. They spoke softly to one another, words of instruction and reassurance mingling with the hum of the gas lamps and the subtle hiss of ether escaping its container. Every utterance, every gesture was measured, a delicate balance between confidence and fear. Hands poised above the patient, the instruments gleamed under the trembling light. Steel and ivory, polished to perfection, reflected the surgeon's eyes like mirrors of intent and consequence. The first incision was made with care, a small, precise movement, and yet the tension in the room was palpable. The assistants held their breaths, fingers resting lightly on instruments, awaiting the patient's response. A murmur, a flicker of eyelid, a soft sigh, each sound carried weight, each subtle movement read as sign or warning. Gaslight revealed every tremor, every bead of sweat, amplifying both the grandeur and the terror of the act. Time became elastic beneath the lamp's wavering glow. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, as if the theater itself resisted the intrusion of human ambition. Families, waiting elsewhere in hushed rooms, could not imagine the silent theater of transformation occurring in their absence. When a patient was returned to consciousness, or some approximation thereof, they often emerged changed in ways subtle or profound. Calmness, obedience, compliance, but also emptiness. The soft erosion of identity, the hollow echo of what had once been vibrant mind and spirit. And when the lamps dimmed for the evening, the theater emptied, save for polished instruments and lingering odors. It was as if the room itself exhaled. Gaslight, once a symbol of clarity and progress, now highlighted the paradox at the heart of Victorian science. A city advancing in knowledge, yet quietly complicit in a creeping, mechanical horror. Outside, fog pressed against windows, the streets whispered with life, and London slept unaware of the shadows that had been cast deep within its hospitals. The operating table, now empty and cold, held the memory of minds divided, of ambition unchecked, and of a nightmare quietly unfolding under the gaslit eye of the metropolis. In the hushed, wood-panelled rooms of London's learned societies, the air smelled of ink, parchment, and the faint lingering sweetness of carbolic from the operating theatres. By day, men of medicine and science gathered around polished tables, quills poised, ink pots open, and journals spread like treasures before them. These were the chronicles of progress, the authoritative records in which each new procedure was measured, calculated, and immortalized. Here, amidst the quiet scratching of pens and the occasional cough, the practice of lobotomy began to take form not only as a method but as a doctrine, a protocol whose implications stretched far beyond the wards where it was performed. The reports were clinical, precise, and seemingly free of emotion. Surgeons described their procedures in meticulous detail: the angle of incision, the depth of insertion, the patient's response to ether, the observed calm or agitation. Each observation was couched in terms of success or complication, improvement or regression, as if the mind were merely a mechanical system to be adjusted. The language was antiseptic, yet in the careful phrasing lurked a tension that few dared articulate openly. Words such as compliant, docile, and controlled were celebrated, while phrases hinting at hollowness, unrecognizable behavior, or loss of individuality were minimized, footnoted, or quietly omitted. The journals became both a repository of knowledge and a veil, concealing the true toll of the experiments behind measured statistics and moral certainty. In corners of these rooms, younger physicians leaned in to take notes, their faces pale in the lamplight, absorbing the ritualized discourse of authority. They marveled at the ingenuity, at the potential to bring order to minds considered unruly, yet beneath their fascination lay unease. They had seen the empty-eyed patients return to their families, the subtle distortions of personality, the quiet despair etched into the faces of those who emerged unchanged in body but hollow in essence. These whispers of reality, however, seldom breached the formal tone of the journals. Science demanded clarity, precision, and the illusion of control, and there was little place for doubt within the pages destined to shape both careers and public perception. Families who read these journals, rare, learned, or curious, were often reassured. The articles conveyed authority, demonstrated systematic success, and promised that the horrors glimpsed in hospital corridors were exceptional rather than inevitable. They spoke of measured interventions and calm restoration, framing the erasure of anxiety and agitation as a triumph of intellect over chaos. Yet for those attuned to nuance, the omissions were deafening. Details of vanished speech, empty stares, and subtle personality erosion were conspicuously absent, leaving only a polished account that suggested control where, in truth, only tentative mastery existed. Even as the journals circulated in the reading rooms of the city's elite, in universities, and in hospital libraries, the pulse of the wards continued unabated. Surgeons referenced the texts, reinforcing their confidence, while patients silently bore the consequences of procedures deemed successful on paper. London itself seemed complicit, its foggy streets and gaslit alleys carrying the whispers of progress that had begun to falter at the edges of human morality. Every report published, every case noted, deepened the chasm between knowledge and consequence, between the polished veneer of science and the quiet horror that threaded through the city's hospitals. By night, when the lamps dimmed and the ink dried, the journals rested on polished shelves, waiting for the next reader to interpret them, unaware of the human cost that lay behind each entry. Within those pages, ambition, curiosity, and fear coexisted, shaping not only medical practice but the very fabric of a metropolis, gradually surrendering its mind to the cold, measured hand of science. London, in all its grandeur and fog, watched silently as its citizens became both subjects and witnesses to a nightmare chronicled in quill, ink, and ether-laden air. The parlours of London, perfumed and polished, hummed with polite conversation and the faint echo of gas lamps through tall windows. Society had long prided itself on decorum, on measured appearances, and on the careful maintenance of order both public and private. Yet beneath the polished veneer, a new fascination had begun to take hold. The promise of the mind perfected, silenced of its anxieties, and made compliant under the precise hand of medical authority. Lobotomy, whispered of in drawing rooms and mentioned casually over afternoon tea, became a mark of enlightened propriety, a demonstration of one's willingness to embrace progress, however unsettling its consequences. Families and acquaintances spoke in hushed tones about the procedure, praising the calm restored in patients, admiring the efficiency of the surgeons, and noting the social advantages of a mind brought to order. Mothers remarked on how restless daughters had grown serene, fathers on the tempering of wayward sons, and servants on the quiet ease that seemed to settle over households in the wake of treatment. The narrative of improvement was carefully constructed, repeated in polite circles and reinforced in journals and newspapers. Few dared to question it openly, for to do so would be to doubt the authority of men of science, to appear ignorant, or worse, to suggest that progress might carry costs beyond comprehension. In salons and study rooms, conversations danced between curiosity and admiration. Learned gentlemen exchanged stories of patients whose agitation had been subdued, whose behaviors had been corrected with a gentle, confident hand. They debated the proper extent of intervention, the necessity of precision, and the ethics of influence, yet their words always returned to praise the ingenuity of the method. The risk was acknowledged only in abstract terms, framed as possibility rather than reality. Families who had not yet witnessed the procedure firsthand took these discussions as evidence of its efficacy, trusting in the moral authority of doctors and the approval of their peers. Servants, who moved between households and hospitals, whispered among themselves, noting the difference in demeanor of those who had undergone treatment. Faces that had once flared with stubbornness or melancholy were now calm, expressions muted yet obedient. The air of respectability extended beyond the front doors into private chambers, influencing conversation, judgment, and expectation. Society itself became an accomplice, eager to see disorder corrected and anxious to display the results as a testament to modernity and refinement. Approval was quiet but pervasive, manifest in subtle nods, invitations to social events, and the gentle exchange of information regarding the latest successes in the wards. Yet even in this seemingly harmonious acceptance, a shadow lingered. Beneath the calm smiles and approving glances, there existed a faint unease, the unarticulated sense that something essential had been altered. The mind, once a private sanctuary, had been made public property in effect, if not in practice, its vulnerabilities exposed to scientific ambition. Gaslight reflected off polished surfaces and instruments alike, revealing the city's complicity in a practice that promised civility while exacting hidden costs. By the evening, when the lamps burned low and the city exhaled beneath the fog, society's approval remained intact, unwavering in the face of quiet horror. Discussions in parlors, journals, and salons reinforced the narrative of progress, obscuring the human toll that lingered in hospital wards and waiting rooms alike. London, elegant and fog-bound, hummed with an uneasy harmony, a metropolis intoxicated by the idea of order and refinement, yet blind to the creeping shadow that stretched from the surgeon's theatres to the heart of every household. The quiet approval of society had begun, and with it, the nightmare of lobotomy grew steadily, woven into the very fabric of the city. The fog pressed low upon London streets, curling around lampposts and creeping into the narrow alleyways where the city's secrets gathered like dust. Here, in these shadowed corners, the whispers began. Servants hurrying between households, apprentices returning from workshops, and cabmen waiting for fares, spoke softly of things that could not be named aloud. Faces returned from hospitals vacant, eyes dull with absence, laughter replaced by silence. It was a murmur that travelled quickly, invisible yet insistent, threading through gaslit streets and over cobbles slick with mist and rain. The city, outwardly refined and orderly, pulsed with an undercurrent of unease. Children huddled close to their mothers on foggy nights, sensing the difference in neighbours' households, the subtle strangeness of those who had passed through the wards. Shopkeepers noted patrons behaving oddly, patrons whose smiles no longer reached their eyes, whose words repeated themselves without meaning. Even the animals of the city seemed to sense the change. Dogs trembled at doors, cats slinked silently along the walls, as if the city's atmosphere had thickened into something almost tangible, heavy with dread. In the taverns and coffee houses, conversation carried the faint scent of fear disguised as curiosity. Patrons spoke of procedures in hushed tones, trading rumors like coin. A daughter made obedient, a husband rendered mute, a governess returned to her household hollowed of all spirit. The words were cautious, filtered through politeness, yet they carried a sharp edge, a recognition that something profound and unsettling was occurring beyond the facades of civility. Gaslight flickered across the faces of listeners, illuminating widened eyes and furrowed brows, as each tale was passed along, distorted and amplified, growing in horror with every repetition. Even the newspapers, those instruments of propriety and persuasion, could not entirely contain the murmurs. Letters to editors hinted at unease, cautious reports of hospital mishaps, and oblique references to the unnerving transformation of certain patients. Editors, wary of scandal yet attuned to public curiosity, printed these with careful wording, often buried beneath advertisements and society notes, allowing the whispers to fester and spread among those who sought them. Thus, the city itself became a participant in its own quiet panic, knowledge leaking slowly from the theatre to the street, from the drawing room to the alleyway. Midnight brought a stillness that did little to calm the city's nerves. The fog thickened, muffling distant footsteps, and the gas lamps cast long, wavering shadows against brick walls. A solitary figure might pause, glance toward a hospital whose windows glowed with pale, steady light, and shiver at the thought of what lay inside. The whispers coalesced into a silent understanding. Progress had its price, and that price was etched into the faces of those returned from the surgeons' tables. Those who had once been vibrant and whole now moved through the city like ghosts, their presence a reminder of ambition's reach and the fragility of the human mind. By dawn, the alleys were still, but the stories persisted. carried from door to door, whispered over fences, and murmured behind closed shutters. London awoke unaware of the full extent of the transformation taking place within its hospitals, yet the shadows had grown, and the city itself bore the weight of something that could not be named openly. Whispers, once faint, had become a rhythm, a pulse that marked the city as changed, its streets alive with quiet terror, and its people unknowingly complicit in a nightmare that stretched beyond the walls of the operating theatre into the very heart of Victorian London. A peculiar sweetness hung in the air, faint yet pervasive, seeping through the corridors of London's hospitals and drifting down to the gaslit streets beyond. It clung to the walls, to the polished wood of benches and chairs, and to the sleeves of visitors who lingered too long in the waiting rooms. This was the smell of ether, cold and insidious, a scent that promised relief yet carried with it the unspoken weight of fear. To those who inhaled it, the odor was both familiar and strange, a signal of the new science that held dominion over the mind, a harbinger of transformations that were irreversible and absolute. Within the operating theatres, the substance's presence was commanding. Nurses measured its flow with meticulous precision, gauging each patient's response with the delicate balance of attentiveness and detachment. The surgeons moved among them, eyes alert and hands steady, as the ether filled lungs and dulled senses, drawing consciousness into a fragile suspension. Patients breathed deeply, unknowing that the sweet vapor which seemed to soothe would also render them malleable, their thoughts and fears softened, their wills temporarily subdued. The procedure, cloaked in antiseptic calm, concealed the profound danger that accompanied it, the loss of self, the erasure of temper, memory, and individuality, all hidden beneath the reassuring glow of gaslight. Outside the theatres, in the waiting rooms and along the corridors, the smell of ether seeped unnoticed into the city. Families arrived, hoping for cures and calm, unaware that the scent carried with it subtle signals of change. Mothers glanced anxiously toward the theatre doors, fathers shifted uneasily in their chairs, and servants whispered among themselves, recognizing the odor as both promise and threat. Those attuned to its presence felt a shiver, an inexplicable unease that clung to the air like a fine mist. Gas lamps cast wavering halos through fogged windows, illuminating the anxiety etched into every face, while the sweet aroma of ether drifted on, a quiet harbinger of the transformations underway. In the corridors between wards, the smell lingered, winding its way past idle patients and polished floors, filling every corner with an invisible yet undeniable presence. The city outside continued unaware, the hum of commerce and horse-drawn carriages masking the subtle intrusion of the hospital's influence. And yet, the effect was insidious. The vapor carried the weight of authority, the weight of science imposing its will upon human minds. Even the most skeptical observer could not deny its presence, nor the strange sense of obedience and silence that seemed to follow in its wake. By evening, the lamps burned low, and the hospital quieted save for the faint, persistent hum of instruments and the steady rhythm of patients' breathing. The smell of ether had become a silent sentinel, lingering in the air like a ghost of what had transpired and what was yet to come. London, shrouded in fog, absorbed it as if the city itself were inhaling the promise of calm, unaware of the hollowed eyes and dulled minds that had emerged from the theatres. Within the walls, the surgeons and nurses moved among the instruments and beds, their faces composed, masks of confidence over uncertainty, while the sweet scent persisted, carrying the memory of both relief and loss. And so the smell of ether became inseparable from Victorian hospitals, a silent witness to ambition and horror entwined. It was the invisible herald of progress and of peril, of calm minds and erased personalities, and it threaded through London's streets as subtly and persistently as the fog. Beneath the glow of gaslight, the city inhaled, unknowing as a nightmare took hold, carried on vapor, steel, and the quiet authority of men who believed themselves masters of the human mind. The corridors of London's hospitals were hushed with a brittle calm, yet beneath the quiet, an unease threaded itself through every polished floorboard and shadowed doorway. Not all who came to the operating theatres had chosen their fate. Some were brought by families desperate for order, some by guardians fearful of the slightest eccentricity, and some by authorities convinced that intervention was for the greater good. Consent, in the eyes of those who controlled the procedures, was often assumed, implied, or quietly ignored, for the mind was considered property public, malleable, and subordinate to reason as defined by men in white coats. Patients arrived in the early morning, shivering with anticipation or terror. Some understood little of the promises whispered by their escorts. Others, aware of the whispered procedures, hoped desperately for the calm that the surgeons assured them they would find. Yet few grasped the extent of what awaited. The waiting rooms, filled with anxious families, echoed with polite reassurances, and the soft rustle of gowns and gloves masked the undercurrent of coercion. Fathers, mothers, and distant relatives signed forms they barely read, nodding to surgeons whose reputations commanded obedience, their words suffused with authority, certainty, and a subtle intimidation. Even the most questioning relative found it difficult to resist the conviction of those whose hands would alter minds. Within the theatres, the notion of consent was abstract, almost irrelevant. Patients, sedated with ether, were instruments upon which the surgeons executed their precise interventions. The trephine, the scalpel, the ivory probe, they moved through tissue with meticulous care, yet beneath the ritual lay a shadowed reality. Autonomy had been suspended and compliance imposed by sedation. Some patients exhibited quiet resistance, a trembling hand, a flicker of the eye, but such signs were fleeting, muted by chemical persuasion and the authority of the attendants. The theatre, gleaming with steel and bathed in flickering gaslight, became a space where decision was removed from the individual and conferred entirely upon those who claimed mastery over mind and reason. Outside the theatres, in the corridors and halls, whispers began to stir. Nurses exchanged furtive glances as they guided patients forward, aware that the absence of consent was an ethical fault line, one that might shatter both trust and reputation if exposed. Yet these concerns were rarely voiced beyond the walls. The city, enveloped in fog and gaslight, remained largely unaware of the quiet coercion taking place behind closed doors. Stories circulated only in hushed tones among servants and attendants, tales of loved ones carried away by polite hands and returned altered, compliant, or diminished in ways too subtle to quantify, yet too profound to ignore. Even when procedures were deemed successful, the cost was measured not in charts or journals, but in the subtle alteration of identity. Patients returned to their families, serene or subdued, their wills softened, their memories intact in part, yet reshaped to align with the surgeon's notion of order. Some families celebrated relief, unaware of the compromises inherent in this compliance. Others recoiled, recognizing too late that the autonomy of the individual had been surrendered in the name of progress. By nightfall, the hospital corridors emptied of visitors, leaving only the lingering scent of ether and the soft, measured breathing of those who had passed beneath the surgeon's hands. Consent, once assumed or ignored, became a silent testament to authority unchallenged, a quiet underpinning of a practice that promised relief while exacting a hidden toll. London, wrapped in its fog and gaslight, breathed on, oblivious to the compromises of will enacted within its hospitals, as the city itself began to absorb the quiet, pervasive horror of minds surrendered without choice. The operating theatre waited in solemn anticipation, a room bathed in the pale, wavering light of gas lamps that trembled against polished walls and gleaming steel. The scent of carbolic and ether clung to the air, heavy and sweet, drifting into every corner, seeping into the polished floors, and curling around the instruments as though it were alive. Within this sanctum of science, each procedure was performed with the precision of ritual, a choreography learned over countless hours of observation, whispered instruction, and meticulous repetition. Surgeons moved like conductors, nurses and attendants following in silent obedience, the theatre itself seeming to pulse with the tension of what was to come. Patients were brought forward on stretchers, their faces pale, eyes wide and limbs trembling. Some understood the significance of the day, others merely followed the directions of guardians or attendants, caught in a tide beyond their comprehension. Each was weighed, measured, examined, a silent appraisal of mind and body, as if the very essence of the person could be quantified. Nurses adjusted blankets and cushions with care, whispered reassurances that hovered between comfort and command, and guided each patient onto the central table with delicate insistence. The theatre, though orderly, held an unspoken terror. Every breath of ether, every movement of the scalpel, carried the promise of change and the shadow of loss. The instruments lay poised like sentinels, each gleaming edge reflecting the gaslight, and each awaiting its turn to carve, probe, or sever. Steel and ivory, polished and arranged with geometric precision, were extensions of the surgeon's intent, yet they were instruments as unpredictable as the human mind itself. The trephine, circular and cold, promised access to thoughts, fears, and impulses. The scalpel offered selective intervention, a means of enforcing calm, compliance, and order. And the ether, sweet and invisible, drew the mind into a fragile suspension, a temporary surrender that permitted hands of authority to shape the contours of thought and temperament without resistance. The ritual was exacting. Surgeons circled the table, discussing angles and depths in hushed tones, exchanging advice on subtle adjustments and minute variations. Nurses passed instruments with unerring accuracy, anticipating each movement and gesture. Every step was deliberate, a choreography intended to produce not only physical effect, but psychological transformation. And yet, beneath the confidence and ceremony, a thread of uncertainty wove through the theatre. The mind, intricate and mercurial, did not always respond predictably. Sometimes the patient stirred, sometimes faint murmurs escaped lips, and sometimes the desired calm revealed itself as something hollow and incomplete. Families waited elsewhere, unaware of the precise movements and subtle sounds that marked the ritual. They trusted the authority of the surgeons, the reputation of the hospitals, and the assurances of nurses who spoke in measured, comforting tones. Outside the theatre, the city continued its rhythm, horses clattering over cobblestones, footsteps echoing through fog-laden streets. But within the ritual unfolded like a quiet, meticulous storm, a ceremony of ambition and consequence intertwined. By the time the final instrument was cleaned, the lamps dimmed, and the theatre emptied, the ritual had left its mark. Patients emerged, changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly, and the theatre itself exhaled a stillness heavy with the residue of human minds altered. The operating theatre, in its solemn choreography of light, steel, and ether, became both altar and crucible, a space where the promise of science collided with the unknown, and where the quiet horror of progress began to unfold. One patient at a time, in the heart of Victorian London, the first patients returned to the wards with their faces pale and eyes unseeing, as though the light of comprehension had been dimmed or extinguished entirely. Those who had once been restless, fretful, or obstinate were now quiet to the point of vacancy, their movements deliberate but devoid of personality, their smiles mechanical, their speech reduced to monosyllables or absent entirely. Nurses whispered to one another in corridors, noting the subtle yet undeniable change, while families, arriving with hope and trepidation, struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the figure before them. The mind, that intricate and unknowable landscape, had been altered irrevocably, leaving only the faint outlines of the person who had once inhabited it. It began with small things, a pause in conversation, a muted expression, the absence of wit or complaint. Then the hollows grew, extending into gestures, posture, and memory. Names once spoken freely now required prompting. Interests, once fervently pursued, vanished like smoke from a candle snuffed in haste. Doctors, noting the clinical calm, hailed these outcomes as evidence of success, praising the procedure in journals and lectures. Yet, even as they documented compliance, the wards themselves whispered of a different truth. Obedience had been purchased at the cost of self, calm at the expense of consciousness. Families observed with a mixture of relief and dread. A mother who had brought a son to silence his violent fits might rejoice at his subdued demeanor, only to find herself startled by the blankness behind his eyes. A husband, hopeful that his wife's incessant anxiety had been tamed, found only stillness where character once resided. The contrast between expectation and reality carved deep lines in the faces of those who lingered, waiting for any spark of recognition, any flicker of the individuality that had once defined their loved one. In drawing rooms and parlors, the hushed reports filtered through the city like fog, shaping gossip, altering perception, and reinforcing both fascination and fear. Within the hospitals, the phenomenon became so common that it was accepted with quiet pragmatism. Nurses adjusted beds, monitored breathing, and noted the subtle differences between patients, yet no words were spoken to mitigate the hollowing effect. Surgeons, their hands steady and movements precise, measured results not in laughter or thought, but in silence and obedience. The theatre's instruments gleamed under the gaslight as though complicit, their edges sharp and unyielding, each cut, each probe, each intervention leaving behind a mind partially or wholly erased. It was a triumph of technique, yet a tragedy of identity, and it would ripple quietly through the households of London, reshaping families and communities alike. Outside, the city remained unaware, continuing its rhythm of commerce, carriage wheels, and footsteps. Yet in alleyways and parlors, whispers hinted at the new order. Neighbors returning altered, servants observing silent changes, the city itself a stage for a creeping horror. The fog, thick and insistent, seemed to echo the erasure within, wrapping the streets in a muffled hush that mirrored the vacant expressions of those recently cured. Progress had been achieved, yes, but at a cost that no journal could fully articulate, no lecture could convey, and no polite society could openly acknowledge. As night settled, the wards exhaled, a quiet, unnerving calm. Patients slept or something like it, while families whispered prayers and questioned the reality of what they had seen. The mind, once a sanctuary, had been made malleable and compliant, yet at the cost of personality, memory, and vitality. London's hospitals, their corridors silent under gaslight and fog, bore witness to the first true erasures, a chilling precursor to a city quietly transformed by the unspoken consequences of ambition and the cold precision of science. The families who had entrusted their loved ones to the surgeon's care often found themselves unprepared for what awaited them. In the quiet hours of the morning, when gas lamps cast long, trembling shadows across the polished floors of London's hospitals, parents, siblings, and guardians were ushered into the wards to behold the results of the procedures they had consented to or assumed they had. They entered cautiously, voices hushed, hands clasped tightly, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The air, thick with the lingering sweetness of ether, seemed to hang heavy, pressing down upon them as though anticipating the shock to come. At first glance, the patients appeared calm, composed, even serene. A daughter who had been restless and tearful now sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes wide and vacant, lips parted in a smile that bore no warmth. A husband who had once been irritable, his mind prone to sudden fits of agitation, now spoke only when prompted, his sentences clipped and devoid of inflection. And a child, formerly lively and mischievous, stared silently at the walls, unaware of the world around them, their small frame rigid with an unnatural stillness. Families hesitated, exchanging glances, seeking reassurance in one another, yet finding only unease reflected back in pale, strained faces. Mothers often reached out instinctively, brushing hair from foreheads, placing fingers against cold hands, hoping to provoke a spark of recognition. Fathers lingered near the bedside, eyes scanning the faces of those who had once been familiar, searching for laughter, curiosity, or memory, only to encounter a blankness that was impossible to ignore. The hollowness was subtle at first, manifest in delayed reactions, muted speech, and absence of familiar mannerisms. Then it became undeniable, a quiet erasure of the mind that no whisper of hope could conceal. Families, confronted with the transformation wrought in the name of progress, struggled to reconcile gratitude for calm with grief for the personality lost in the process. Servants and attendants moved through the wards with practiced composure, guiding relatives with soft-spoken instructions, masking their own unease. They had witnessed these changes countless times, seen the blank faces and vacant eyes, noted the subtle distortions of behavior, and yet were compelled to present the scene as ordinary. Their quiet competence provided only minimal comfort, for the hollowing could not be undone, and no protocol existed to restore the spark of individuality that had been subdued, dulled, or erased entirely. Conversations were tentative, broken, filled with pauses and careful phrasing. "Is he well?" a mother might ask, her voice trembling despite the gloves she clutched. "Yes, calm," the nurse would reply, emphasizing composure while avoiding the truth of vacancy. The words offered assurance, but the eyes told a different story, hinting at a subtle horror that families felt yet dared not fully acknowledge. The theatre's work had succeeded in its immediate purpose, obedience, tranquility, and compliance, but at the cost of vitality, spontaneity, and character. By evening, as gas lamps dimmed and the fog pressed against the windows, the families departed, returning to homes filled with silent hallways and whispered uncertainty. The wards remained, quiet yet heavy, a testament to ambition and authority unchecked. Outside, London thrummed with life, oblivious to the private horrors within its hospitals. And yet, in parlours, servants' quarters, and whispered confidences, the hollowed figures would become a constant reminder. The cost of progress was not merely measured in health restored, but in minds irrevocably altered, and in a city slowly coming to understand the quiet weight of ambition pursued without conscience. In the hushed chambers of London's medical societies, where polished wood gleamed beneath the flicker of gaslight and the scent of ink and carbolic lingered in the air, the men of science gathered to discuss matters of conscience, procedure, and consequence. The topic of lobotomy had ignited fierce debate, though never loud enough to disturb the polite rhythm of daily life outside. Here, in the quiet of lecture halls and council rooms, doctors weighed ambition against morality, technique against consequence, and the subtle terror unfolding in their wards against the polished veneer of progress. Voices were measured, deliberate, each word carefully chosen. Some extolled the procedure as a triumph of intellect over disorder, a scientific victory in which minds once unruly were made compliant. Anxiety was silenced, and families were spared daily torment. They cited reports from the wards, the journals of peers, and the carefully recorded outcomes, compliance, calmness, and obedience, all framed as evidence of success. Yet beneath these presentations lingered a silent unease, manifest in pauses, slight frowns, and glances exchanged across polished tables. The mind, they acknowledged privately, was not simply a mechanism to be repaired. It was a landscape of memory, personality, and emotion, a terrain whose alteration could yield unforeseen and irreversible consequences. A few voices ventured into territory deemed almost heretical, the ethical limits of intervention. Could calm imposed by scalpel and ether truly be considered relief? or was it merely the suppression of individuality? One physician, pale and thin, argued that the procedure, while medically effective, might render patients obedient yet hollow, obedient yet robbed of the spark that had once defined them. His colleagues nodded politely, murmured agreement, and then returned to clinical data, as though acknowledgement of the truth was more dangerous than denial. Another suggested stricter guidelines, proposing that consent be made explicit, that families be fully informed, that children be excluded until the mind could understand what was to come. Yet even these suggestions were tempered by the pervasive belief in progress, the seductive assurance that control over thought was not only possible but morally justifiable. The journals themselves were battlegrounds of subtle argument. Editors balanced the desire to promote innovation with the quiet whispers of conscience. Articles praised the procedure, detailing technique, angles of incision, and measured doses of ether, yet references to erasure, hollowness, or loss of identity were buried in footnotes, softened by language that minimized consequence. Readers of these journals, families, physicians, and students alike, were left with the impression that progress had a steady hand, even as those in the hospitals quietly witnessed the shadows creeping across the minds of patients. Outside the polished halls, the city continued under fog and gaslight, indifferent to debates of ethics and morality. Yet the consequences of these discussions seeped quietly into wards, parlors, and alleyways. Surgeons, bound by reputation and ambition, returned to the theaters with their instruments gleaming, their hands steady, and their minds reconciled, however uneasily, to the balance between ethical uncertainty and scientific authority. Patients awaited their turn beneath the flickering lamps, unaware that their fate had been the subject of whispered deliberations, and that the line between cure and calamity had been debated but never fully resolved. By nightfall, the chambers emptied, leaving behind ink-stained desks, journals thick with argument, and a lingering sense of tension. The debates had been polite, measured, and precise, yet the questions remained unresolved, echoing in the minds of those who practiced the art. At what point does the pursuit of knowledge become complicity in destruction? And in the quiet gaslit streets of London, the answer remained as elusive as the human mind itself, waiting to be discovered in the shadowed wards where ambition met consequence and where the nightmare of progress quietly unfolded. The morning papers arrived at the doors of London with a soft rustle, their pages damp with mist and ink, carrying tidings of both triumph and subtle unease. In the parlors of the city's middle class, polished mahogany tables bore the weight of reports detailing the latest advancements in medicine, the careful accounts of surgeons' successes, and the measured praise of progress that promised to tame disorder and bring calm to troubled minds. Yet, between the lines, in the halftones and oblique phrasing, something else lingered, the faintest suggestion that the marvels celebrated might come at an unseen cost. Families read aloud, sipping tea that steamed in porcelain cups, sharing both admiration and apprehension. "They say he is entirely changed," a mother would murmur, her fingers tracing the delicate rim of the cup, calm, compliant, quiet, as though the unrest has been lifted. Her husband nodded, adjusting his waistcoat, eyes flicking to the paragraph describing the meticulous instruments, the careful use of ether, the procedural exactness that promised safety. Yet in the back of every mind, questions stirred. At what price did calm come, and what had been silenced in the pursuit of order? Children hovered nearby, curious yet cautious, catching only fragments of words that seemed to speak of miracle and dread intertwined. In the alleys and side streets, where servants and apprentices gathered before the day's labor, newspapers were passed discreetly, folded to hide their contents from prying eyes. Whispered readings conveyed the essence of the reports. A mind once restless is now subdued, anxiety erased, obedience restored. The marvels of modern science unfold in white-coated theaters where hands guided, knives precise, and the air carried the peculiar sweetness of ether. Even here, in the narrow, fog-bound streets, the mixture of fascination and fear was palpable. The city had never been so close to the mind itself, so intimately connected to the private mechanisms of thought, and yet so distant from its consequences. Reporters, eager to titillate without alarm, framed each story with an almost reverent tone. Successes were celebrated in bold headlines, cases of unusual calm praised in meticulous prose. The language suggested a triumph of intellect over chaos, a promise that the restless, the anxious, and the eccentric could be brought into harmony with polite society. Rarely, almost buried in paragraphs or relegated to footnotes, were references to the vacuous stares, the loss of vitality, the subtle erasure of character that accompanied the procedure. These omissions allowed readers to perceive certainty where there was only approximation, calm where there was hidden horror. By afternoon, coffee houses and bookshops thrummed with conversation. Patrons debated the accounts with polite curiosity, speculating on whether the procedures might benefit their own families, neighbors, or acquaintances. Some were fascinated by the promise of control over mind and emotion, while others felt a quiet, instinctive hesitation, a recognition that progress, however elegant, might harbor consequences unspoken. The gaslight flickered through windows as voices rose and fell, blending admiration with unease, curiosity with fear, the city itself vibrating with the tension between what was celebrated in ink and what was quietly experienced in wards and alleyways. Even as night descended, the newspapers remained in parlors and reading rooms, their ink drying into permanence, shaping public perception, and reinforcing a narrative of accomplishment and authority. Yet in the silent corridors of hospitals, the empty eyes of patients and the subtle hollows in their expressions contradicted the printed word. London's fog seemed to carry both the triumphs and the unspoken dread, a reminder that the city's curiosity and admiration could not shield it from the quiet horror, quietly unfolding within its hospitals, one mind at a time. The wards of London's hospitals were quiet, too quiet, as if the very walls held their breath in anticipation of what had been wrought within. Gas lamps flickered weakly along the corridors, casting elongated shadows over rows of patients whose stillness was at once unnatural and complete. The smell of ether lingered like a phantom, sweet and cloying, weaving through the air and wrapping itself around the beds, the instruments, and the quiet figures who attended to them. Nurses moved softly, their footsteps measured, voices subdued, as though the slightest sound might shatter the fragile calm that had settled over the room. Patients lay motionless, their hands folded neatly upon their laps or across their chests, faces pale and expressionless. Some stared into space with eyes that saw but did not perceive, tracking movement only in the vaguest sense, their minds suspended in a liminal state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness. Others whispered faintly, murmurs devoid of coherent thought, their words soft as a sigh and just as insubstantial. The transformation wrought by the surgeon's hands had rendered them obedient and tranquil, yet robbed them of the vitality, spontaneity, and awareness that had once marked their existence. The silence was not comforting, it was a weight pressing down upon the corridors, heavy and tangible. Visitors who entered the wards were immediately struck by this unnatural quiet. Families approached cautiously, some daring a hand to touch a shoulder or smooth a lock of hair, hoping to detect some spark of recognition. Often, they found only vacancy, a stillness that both reassured and terrified. Mothers whispered prayers beneath their breath, fathers stiffened their posture and stared, and servants glanced nervously at one another, exchanging quiet, knowing looks. The city outside continued unaware, its streets alive with the clatter of hooves and the distant cries of vendors. Yet within these walls, a different rhythm prevailed, a rhythm measured not by commerce or movement, but by the slow, deliberate breathing of those whose minds had been altered beyond return. Nurses carried out their duties with mechanical precision, administering medications, adjusting pillows, and noting vital signs, their hands steady, faces composed. Yet even they could not entirely mask the unease that lingered in the air. Every glance at a patient's vacant eyes, every whisper of incoherent murmuring, reminded them of the fragile boundary between life as it had been and life as it had become. Conversations among the staff were careful, coded in professional language, masking the horror that even the most learned could not fully articulate. The wards were a theatre of obedience and stillness, yet beneath the surface simmered a quiet, persistent dread that had no outlet but in these whispered observations. Time passed with slow, unyielding wait. Hours stretched and contracted, marked only by the faint ticking of clocks and the occasional passing of a nurse along the corridor. Patients remained unchanged, their presence a constant reminder of the consequences of ambition, precision, and human curiosity pursued without full reckoning. And in the stillness one could almost hear the echo of what had been lost. Laughter, speech, memory, and will, all smoothed into an ordered calm that satisfied the surface demands of science, but betrayed the hidden cost to human life. By nightfall, the wards exhaled a silence that was heavy with unspoken knowledge. The lamps dimmed, shadows lengthened, and the city's fog crept in through open windows, pressing against the walls like a conspirator. In this quiet, the true nature of progress became apparent, that for every mind made orderly, a spark had been extinguished. For every patient calmed, a piece of humanity had been quietly erased. London slept unaware, but the silent wards bore witness, their stillness a testament to the city's complicity in a nightmare that was now woven into the very fabric of its hospitals. Night descended upon London with a thick, pressing fog, curling through narrow alleys, slipping beneath doors, and drifting over the cobblestones like a ghost of its own making. Within the hospitals, the lamps flickered uncertainly, casting long, trembling shadows along the walls of the surgical theatres and corridors. It was during these hours that the ether, sweet, cold, and insidious, spread most fully, seeping into every corner of the wards, filling rooms, and lingering in the breath of nurses, attendants, and patients alike. The vapor hung heavy, almost tactile, wrapping itself around limbs, winding through hair, and settling on skin, a silent herald of transformation that was both miraculous and terrifying. Surgeons moved through the theatre with their customary calm, hands steady above polished instruments, eyes flicking between monitors, charts, and the pallid faces of those who had been sedated. They spoke softly to one another, voices barely audible above the hum of gas lamps and the subtle hiss of ether escaping its canisters. Each step was deliberate, measured, rehearsed, yet beneath the professional cadence lay a quiet awareness of the peril inherent in their craft. The mind, fragile and mercurial, did not always respond as expected. Compliance was never guaranteed, and the vapor that dulled thought carried with it a risk of permanent alteration. Still, ambition drove them forward, each inhalation of ether, a bridge between intent and action, between order and the unknown. In the wards, patients drifted under its influence, suspended in a space between consciousness and oblivion. Limbs slackened, eyes fluttered, and even the most restless bodies lay quiet, softened into a fragile submission. Some murmured incoherently, their words fragments of memory and thought, slipping through the fingers of attention before they could form meaning. Others lay still, breathing slow and steady, their vacant eyes staring toward ceilings that had no ceiling, into spaces their own minds could no longer inhabit. Nurses moved among them silently, adjusting blankets, checking pulses, noting responses with the practiced detachment of those who had become accustomed to the strange rhythm of ether and human fragility. Beyond the theatre doors, the city slept, unaware of the creeping, pervasive influence of the vapor. Gaslight shimmered through fog, casting wavering reflections on wet cobblestones, masking the subtle infiltration of hospitals' influence into the very atmosphere of London. The servants who lingered in corridors, taking care of the patients, whispered to one another about the strange calm that hung over the wards, the eerie silence that replaced the ordinary restlessness of the human mind. Even they felt the weight of the ether, inhaling it as part of their nightly duties, their senses dulled in sympathy with the patients whose wills had been subdued. By midnight, the ether had settled into the walls, the beds, and the very air of the building. Its presence was inescapable, a silent force shaping thought, softening resistance, and marking the beginning of a transformation that was as complete as it was terrifying. The wards exhaled a stillness, heavy and tangible, while the gas lamps flickered low, and London itself seemed to inhale with the city's own quiet anticipation. For in that sweet, pervasive scent lay both promise and peril, relief for some, compliance for all, and the beginning of a nightmare that would spread beyond the hospitals, beyond the wards, and into the very consciousness of the metropolis itself. The streets of London, slick with fog and rain, carried whispers that flickered through the city like lanterns in the mist. Rumors of altered minds and vacant stares crept from household to household, traveling along cobbled alleyways and through drawing rooms alike. Servants spoke quietly among themselves, exchanging hushed observations about patients returned from the wards, while shopkeepers leaned toward one another across counters, lowering their voices as though even the gas lamps might overhear. Tales circulated of children rendered silent, wives subdued to near automatism, husbands calm but hollow, and each story grew more elaborate with each telling, threaded through the city like a living fog, indistinguishable from the actual mist that clung to walls and windows. Newspapers, careful to maintain civility, could not entirely contain the gossip. Headlines praised the marvels of modern science and the ingenuity of surgeons, while footnotes hinted at misadventures, unusual recoveries, or complications that were quickly rationalized. Families read these accounts in parlors, sipping tea with trembling hands, exchanging glances that flickered between pride in progress and quiet apprehension. In private, letters carried warnings cloaked as curiosity, recounting visits to hospitals where patients had returned with vacant expressions or subtle disturbances of personality. These accounts were selective, emphasizing improvement and obedience, yet the undercurrent of unease was impossible to suppress completely. In the poorer districts, rumors took on a darker, almost mythic quality. Mothers spoke of children wandering corridors, eyes glazed, murmuring incoherently in the dead of night. Fathers murmured about husbands who no longer argued, who moved as though compelled by invisible hands, their temper dulled, their ambitions flattened. Servants whispered of patients who shuffled silently through wards, blank faces reflecting the gaslight with an unnatural sheen, and of the occasional shriek that punctuated the antiseptic calm, a sound that reverberated through hallways and lingered long after it had ceased. These stories, half observed and half imagined, spread quickly, transforming the quiet horror of the hospitals into a pervasive, city-wide unease. Even the most learned members of society could not entirely ignore the rumors. Gentlemen who frequented scientific lectures noted with a subtle shiver that the cases reported in journals, though clinically precise, seemed sanitized, stripped of the human consequence that whispered insistently in alleyways and servant quarters. Ladies, conversant in polite circles, spoke with polite curiosity, yet their voices sometimes faltered, betraying a recognition that the achievements of science were not without shadow. Rumors, after all, carry the subtle weight of intuition, and intuition, sharpened by observation and social proximity, often apprehended what the journals refused to acknowledge, that the human mind, once altered by blade and ether, did not always return to its former self. By night, the whispers coalesced into a low, persistent hum, threading through the gaslit streets, curling around windows and pressing against doors. London slept uneasily beneath the fog, oblivious to the depth of change wrought within its hospitals, yet sensitive to the tension carried by rumour. Servants, mothers, fathers, and children alike felt its weight, a subtle tremor that marked the city as transformed. It was a quiet dread, not openly declared, yet tangible in every glance, every hesitation, every retelling of an odd, unsettling encounter. And as the gas lamps flickered low and shadows deepened, it became apparent that the nightmare of lobotomy, whispered first in corridors and parlours, had begun to seep into the very consciousness of the metropolis, a subtle contagion of fear, fascination, and the unknown. By the early hours of morning, the wards of London's hospitals exhaled a quiet, unsettling stillness. The patients lay arranged with mechanical precision, their hands folded, faces serene, eyes vacant yet unblinking, as though the essence of their individuality had been smoothed away like wax under careful hands. The calm that now dominated these rooms was seductive in its apparent perfection. No complaints, no agitation, no restless movements that might disrupt the meticulous order the surgeons so prized. Visitors might have admired the apparent peace, seeing obedience where subtle horror had taken root, yet beneath the surface, the serenity was brittle, imposed rather than natural, and it spread with a subtle insistence that unsettled those attuned to its quiet deviance. Surgeons moved through the wards with an air of satisfaction, observing the results of their craft with clinical detachment. The patient's composure was often presented in journals as evidence of efficacy, the restless made docile, the anxious made calm, disorder rendered orderly by precise intervention. Yet even within these reports, the truth was tempered by careful phrasing. The calm, though lauded, was not the organic serenity of healing. It was an artificial suspension, a quiet void where vitality once resided. Nurses, walking softly along the polished floors, noted the subtle hollows in expression and gesture, whispering to one another in tones that acknowledged what could not be recorded, that the calm was achieved at the expense of thought, personality, and sometimes memory. Families arriving in the early morning fog were often the first to confront the eerie uniformity. Mothers reached out instinctively, fingertips grazing cold hands, searching for recognition in eyes that returned none. Fathers adjusted collars nervously, glancing from patient to nurse, noting the subtle obedience that felt at once miraculous and terrifying. Children, too young to comprehend fully, stared in silent fascination, learning quickly that the individual they had known had been reshaped and that the room itself resonated with a calm that was almost supernatural in its thoroughness. Visitors whispered among themselves, drawing quiet conclusions, imagining the ease of life now possible with minds rendered compliant. Yet each intuition carried a subtle dread, a recognition that such tranquility might have demanded too great a cost. The calm extended beyond the immediate wards, seeping through corridors and stairwells like a contagion. Servants, carrying trays or guiding the next patient forward, inhaled the faint, sweet odor of ether and carried its effects into the air around them. The quiet obedience of one room seemed to ripple outward, touching another patient, another hallway, another household waiting with apprehension or hope. It was a pervasive force, subtle yet insistent, shaping interactions and impressions, and yet it bore the quiet weight of unease. Those sensitive to the nuances of behavior recognized that while the external manifestations of disorder had been smoothed away, the underlying human essence had been diminished. The mind, it seemed, could be quieted too easily, and in that ease lay an ethical chasm that could not be ignored. Outside the hospitals, London itself exhaled under fog and gaslight, unaware of the pattern being laid within its walls. Yet in the whispering alleyways, among servants' gossip, and behind the closed shutters of drawing rooms, an understanding began to circulate that this calm, so prized and celebrated, was both a marvel and a warning. It spread easily because it required nothing of the patient's own will, demanded no reflection or adaptation, and yet carried with it the hollowing of human complexity. The city, shrouded in mist, seemed to sense the unnatural order within, as though the very streets and fog conspired to echo the quiet, pervasive unease of minds rendered obedient and spirits softened, leaving in their wake a calm too complete, too artificial, and too dangerous to ignore. Within the opulent parlours and drawing rooms of London's most esteemed families, a new fascination had begun to take root, one that mingled curiosity, ambition, and the quiet assurance of propriety. It was whispered in the hush of silk curtains, under the glare of polished candelabras, that minds could be disciplined, personalities refined, and the restless tamed not through education, persuasion, or morality, but through the precise intervention of men in white coats, armed with steel, ether, and an audacious confidence in their own authority. Lobotomy, once confined to distant hospitals, had become a subject of polite discussion, an experiment in refinement, and for the wealthy, a means of demonstrating enlightened taste and the mastery of human disorder. Parents of high society approached the hospitals with an air of both hope and control, selecting physicians renowned for their discretion, skill, and the subtlety of their methods. Children, daughters, and sons alike were presented under the guise of care, a restive temperament here, a melancholic disposition there, a hint of rebellion or hysteria, all catalogued meticulously and submitted to the scrutiny of medical authority. Mothers, gloved hands clutching embroidered handkerchiefs, spoke softly of quiet evenings disturbed by anxieties or outbursts, while fathers nodded, adjusting the folds of their waistcoats, content to defer moral judgment to the assured competence of the surgeons. For them, the procedure was not only a matter of medical intervention, it was a demonstration of social order, a tangible proof that intellect, discipline, and science could render even the human mind compliant. Surgeons, conscious of the status of their clientele, conducted these experiments with meticulous ceremony. The instruments gleamed under gaslight, each handle polished to perfection, each blade a promise of control. Ether filled the air in measured waves, sweet and insidious, dulling resistance and rendering the patient supple to instruction. Nurses moved silently, attending to both patient and procedure with precision, ensuring that the ritual unfolded with the calm efficiency expected by the observers. Every motion, every word, was choreographed to convey competence and authority, yet beneath the surface lay a tension, subtle but persistent, as the unpredictability of the human mind reminded even the most confident surgeon that compliance was never absolute. In the parlors and salons of the city, tales of success traveled quickly. A daughter returned serene, her anxieties muted. A son previously prone to fits of anger now walked with measured steps and softened voice. Neighbors, acquaintances, and friends whispered admiration, interpreting these changes as evidence of scientific marvel and enlightened upbringing. Yet the calm, admired as a virtue, often masked a subtle erasure. Personality diminished, spontaneity subdued, and curiosity stilled. Behind the polite smiles and nods of approval lay a recognition, often unspoken, that the procedure exacted a quiet toll, one that the journals and newspapers only hinted at in footnotes, careful to preserve the illusion of triumph. Even servants, who observed these changes in private corridors or while attending patients, spoke cautiously among themselves. They had seen the vacant stares, the absence of laughter, the soft obedience that replaced argument or whim. These subtle horrors, invisible to polite society, were the price of the experiments. The wealthy praised the results, oblivious to the hollowness that spread like an undercurrent beneath the veneer of refinement. And as London's fog pressed against the windows of these grand houses, mingling with the scent of polished wood and candle smoke, A quiet unease lingered, a recognition that in the pursuit of perfection, ambition had begun to claim the very essence of those it sought to improve. Within the gas-lit halls of London's hospitals, the figure of the surgeon assumed an almost divine stature. Families approached them with a mixture of reverence and apprehension, their voices hushed, their hands trembling, as if crossing the threshold of the theatre required more than mere etiquette. It demanded submission to authority as absolute as law. In the flickering light of lamps, surgeons moved with the assured precision of men who believed themselves arbiters of the mind, arbiters of sanity, and, perhaps unknowingly, arbiters of the soul itself. Their knowledge, their hands and their instruments conferred upon them a godlike power, the ability to sculpt obedience from chaos, calm from agitation, and compliance from disorder. The patients, sedated by ether and softened by circumstance, were little more than vessels upon which this authority could act. Limbs slackened, eyes half closed, expressions neutralized. The will, once fiery or restless, was rendered pliable beneath the surgeon's meticulous touch. To the attending families, this calm was evidence of skill, of intellect, of divine foresight, though the reality beneath the veneer of success was far more complex and far more chilling. Obedience had been achieved, yes, but in its place often lingered emptiness, a silent echo of the individuality that had been smoothed away. The surgeon's power was absolute in appearance, unquestionable in effect, yet fragile, held in tension between human ambition and the unpredictable nature of the mind. In lecture halls and professional gatherings, the surgeon was lauded as a figure of singular insight, a man capable of conquering what was once deemed uncontrollable. His tools, trephine, scalpel, and ether were described with precision and care, almost ritualistically, as instruments of revelation rather than destruction. Yet within the whispered corridors of practice, within the quiet corridors of the wards, there existed acknowledgement of a more troubling truth. The surgeon, for all his mastery, wielded power over life and identity with consequences not fully understood. Every incision, every measured inhalation of ether, carried the risk of permanent alteration, and yet the authority of the surgeon often silenced doubt, both in himself and in the families who looked to him for guidance. Servants, nurses, and junior physicians were acutely aware of the reverence with which the surgeon was treated. They observed his every gesture, imitated his precision, and witnessed the awe-struck deference of those whose loved ones had been placed in his care. Even in private, they noted the subtle tremor beneath the calm, the quiet hesitation before an incision, the pause before a measured cut, evidence that, for all his apparent certainty, the surgeon's godlike authority was delicately balanced upon skill, courage, and a tenuous understanding of the mind itself. Yet these observations were rarely spoken aloud. The mythology of the surgeon as deity was essential for both public trust and the smooth execution of procedures. Outside the theatres, the city continued its rhythm. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over wet cobblestones, street vendors called softly to early risers, and fog pressed in from the Thames, carrying the faint, sweet scent of ether into alleys and parlours alike. Families returning home spoke of calm restored, obedience achieved, and disorder subdued, reinforcing the notion that the surgeon's authority was both absolute and necessary. Yet in the quiet, in the shadows of wards and alleys, the hollow eyes of patients, the soft murmur of voices stripped of inflection, and the pervasive stillness of altered minds whispered a more complex truth. That divinity had been assumed, yes, but it was a power fraught with peril, fragile and terrifying, and the cost of its exercise would echo quietly through the households of London for years to come. The smallest beds in the wards, lined in neat rows beneath trembling gas lamps, often held the most fragile lives. Children, delicate and unformed, were brought to the operating theatres under the guise of care, their anxieties dismissed as trivial, their restlessness interpreted as defect. Mothers and fathers accompanied them with hands trembling beneath gloves, whispering reassurances that the children could not fully comprehend, their eyes betraying both hope and unspoken dread. The very presence of youth heightened the sense of moral weight. To intervene in a mind not yet fully matured was to assume authority over the foundation of identity itself. Yet the promise of calm, of obedience, and of relief from temperament was too seductive for many families to resist. In the theatres, the instruments gleamed under gaslight with an almost ritualistic precision. Tiny trephines and scaled-down scalpels lay arranged upon trays, awaiting hands confident in both skill and the authority vested by society. Ether, sweet and invisible, drifted through the room, curling around the delicate bodies and dulling both awareness and resistance. Nurses moved with a careful attentiveness, adjusting blankets, ensuring limbs were supported, and monitoring each patient with an expertise born of repeated exposure. The children, lulled by sedative vapors, lost their natural defenses. Their wills softened before any incision could be made. It was a chilling dance of authority and vulnerability. Knowledge imposed upon innocence, skill applied to the unformed mind. Even as the surgeons labored with meticulous care, attention pervaded the theater. Unlike adults, whose habits and personality could be measured against the standards of prior observation, children were uncharted territory, their minds volatile, unpredictable, and unfinished. The slightest miscalculation could erase more than anxiety. It could alter memory, personality, and the very capacity for thought. The calm achieved was fragile and absolute only in appearance. Beneath it lay a quiet erasure, a soft silencing that would echo through the remainder of the child's life. Yet families, eager for improvement and reassured by the surgeon's poise, rarely questioned the means by which these changes were accomplished. Beyond the wards, in homes and parlors, stories of children returned calm and compliant spread quickly, both in admiration and in subtle unease. Gentlemen and ladies spoke in hushed tones about the marvels of modern science, praising the ingenuity that rendered youth obedient and tranquility restored. But servants and attendants, who had seen the faint hollows in expression, the vacant eyes, and the subtle disconnection from memory and emotion, whispered a quieter truth. Compliance had been purchased at a cost too vast to be fully acknowledged. Observers began to notice that children who had once displayed curiosity or mischief now moved with a subdued precision. Their personalities softened, their independence diminished, and their laughter muted. The city itself, under fog and gaslight, remained largely unaware of the quiet terror that unfolded within its hospitals. The risk to children so delicate, so easily influenced, was largely invisible, acknowledged only in whispers, furtive glances, and journal footnotes that minimized consequence. And yet the impact was profound. For each mind altered in innocence, a household was subtly transformed. Families learning to live alongside compliance that had been imposed rather than nurtured. London's streets hummed with life, oblivious to the consequences, while within the wards, the youngest were quietly reshaped in ways that would echo through their years, a reminder that in the pursuit of order, the most vulnerable often paid the heaviest toll. In the shadowed corners of London's hospitals, the servants moved with quiet efficiency, their gloved hands carrying trays of instruments, folded linens, and messages between wards. They observed everything, yet were expected to speak little. Polished floors reflected their careful steps, the gas lamps above casting trembling light across features strained with discretion. These attendants, nurses, aides, porters, and household servants, assigned to high-born families, witnessed the transformations that the surgeons wrought on their patients, seeing what the journals carefully omitted and what polite society preferred to ignore. Their position was precarious, observers of horrors cloaked in civility, privy to the subtleties of human alteration, while forbidden to comment, question, or intervene. They saw the children first, small forms rendered calm and compliant beneath the soft, invasive haze of ether. They saw mothers clutching hands, fathers leaning anxiously over stretchers, all waiting for signs of restoration that were measured in obedience rather than understanding. And the servants, moving silently among the beds, noted the peculiar blankness, the faint hollows in expressions, the absence of spark that had once defined personality. Every detail was recorded in quiet observation. The way eyelids fluttered without focus, the mechanical folding of hands, the slow, deliberate breathing that seemed more imposed than natural. Yet no word passed their lips. To speak aloud would be to disrupt the order, to challenge authority, to risk censure. In the corridors connecting theatres and wards, whispers carried between attendants like invisible threads. A nurse might remark softly on a patient's vacant gaze, an orderly on the unnatural stillness of a formerly restless child. These murmurs, though quiet and cautious, spread among the servants like a secret knowledge, a shared understanding of what polite society would not acknowledge. In kitchens, sculleries, and servant halls, these stories were repeated in hushed tones. She used to laugh, one might say, and now she stares. Or master moves quietly, never questioning, as if something within has been smoothed away. The weight of observation settled upon them, an unspoken burden, the knowledge that they bore witness to both wonder and horror. Yet the servants' insights were not merely passive. Their attentiveness shaped care, influenced procedure, and occasionally served as an unacknowledged check upon error. They guided patients with deft hands, anticipating discomforts or reactions, smoothing sheets and adjusting positions, all while noting the subtle responses that might elude the surgeon's gaze. Their awareness became a quiet counterbalance to authority, a layer of human observation beneath the clinical rituals, yet one that remained invisible in the journals, unmentioned in polite conversation, and unrecognized by the families who entrusted their loved ones to the hospital's care. By night, as the wards exhaled in heavy silence, the servants retired to narrow quarters or back alleys, carrying the residue of the day in their minds and the faint scent of ether on their gloves and clothing. London outside slumbered, fog pressing against streets and windows, unaware of the quiet witnesses who had observed the transformation of minds and spirits within its hospitals. And in the quiet, servants knew the truth. The calm, the obedience, and the apparent serenity celebrated by society were only one facet of a more complex reality. Beneath the veneer of progress lay a cost unspoken, visible only to those who moved unseen through the wards, who watched, who remembered, and who carried the secret knowledge of what had been lost in the name of order. The city of London moved through the fog with its usual rhythm, carriages rattling across cobblestones, footsteps echoing through narrow alleys, and the faint clatter of vendors setting out wares in the early hours. Yet beneath this outward calm, an undercurrent of unease had begun to spread, subtle but persistent, threading itself through households, parlours, and servant quarters alike. Whispers of altered minds, vacant stares, and children returned subdued from the hospitals moved like a quiet wind through the city, reaching ears attuned to nuance and bending perception in ways both alarming and inescapable. Families who had previously trusted in the authority of surgeons now paused, their confidence tempered by subtle, inexplicable observations. A daughter returned serene but unresponsive, a son obedient but hollow, a governess quiet, yet with an emptiness that did not belong to her nature. Even those who had celebrated the promise of order found themselves troubled, noting the faint hesitations in speech, the mechanical motions, the absence of curiosity that had once animated their households. Conversations in drawing rooms were tinged with caution, praise of scientific achievement tempered by unease, a recognition that calm had been achieved at the expense of what was essential to human experience. In the wards and corridors of the hospitals themselves, the subtle panic was more palpable. Nurses whispered between beds, noting changes that were alarming yet unrecorded, their eyes meeting across floors polished to a sterile sheen. Patients moved with an unnatural precision, their motions deliberate, their expressions muted. Occasionally a murmur would escape a patient's lips, a fragment of memory, a dissonant note in an otherwise orderly composition. The staff, while outwardly calm, felt the weight of the uncanny, the knowledge that the procedures, though heralded as triumphs, had yielded outcomes that could not be entirely controlled, fully predicted, or publicly acknowledged. The fog that wrapped the streets seemed to echo the quiet panic within, pressing against windows, curling beneath doors, and carrying the faint, sweet scent of ether outward into the city. Servants, apprentices, and those with eyes attuned to nuance noticed subtle shifts, the hollowing of conversation, the mechanical politeness in previously spirited youths, the quiet compliance of adults who had once argued, resisted, or laughed freely. Rumors spread, carried along with the damp mist, blending observation with speculation, until the boundaries between truth and fear became indistinct. Even in markets and coffee houses, the atmosphere was tinged with anticipation, as though the city itself waited for confirmation of the subtle horror that had begun to seep from hospitals into parlor and alley alike. By evening, as gas lamps flickered against fog and rain, the quiet panic had become a rhythm, a pulse beneath the city's normal clamor. Families lingered over evening tea with conversations interrupted by sudden recollections of what they had observed. Servants moved more cautiously, noting the vacant stares of those recently returned from the wards. Children in wealthier households spoke less, observed more, and mirrored the soft obedience that had begun to define the new normal. London, outwardly magnificent, elegant, and orderly, had begun to feel the first tremors of unease, a city straining against knowledge too subtle to articulate yet too pervasive to ignore. And in the stillness of the night, beneath the flickering lamps and creeping fog, the city exhaled uneasily. The quiet panic, unacknowledged by newspapers, unspoken in parlors yet whispered in corridors and alleyways, marked the beginning of a transformation as pervasive as the fog itself. Lobotomy, heralded as a triumph of science and civility, had begun to etch itself into the collective consciousness of London, leaving behind a city that moved with measured grace above, yet trembled beneath, haunted by the subtle, creeping terror of minds forever altered. In the dimly lit rooms of Victorian households, letters began to arrive with an almost clandestine urgency. Sealed in cream-colored envelopes, their edges neatly trimmed, they bore the faint scent of carbolic and ink, a subtle reminder that they had traversed the sterile corridors of the hospitals, carried by attendants whose hands had guided patients into the theater and back. These letters, dispatched under the guise of routine communication, contained accounts of the wards that were at once clinical and quietly horrifying. Written by doctors, nurses, and occasionally young apprentices, they chronicled the results of the procedures, offering a veneer of explanation while hinting at consequences too delicate, too alarming, to fully articulate in polite prose. Mothers unfolded the letters with fingers that trembled slightly beneath the lace of their gloves, eyes scanning carefully chosen words that described the patient's calm demeanor, measured responses, and apparent compliance. Fathers, glancing over shoulders, noted the careful tone, the meticulous documentation of vitals, sleep patterns, and behavioral observation. Yet in the careful phrasing lay subtle admissions, the occasional mention of vacant eyes, the description of gestures lacking spontaneity, and the quiet acknowledgement that personality, memory, or curiosity had been diminished. Each letter carried the duality of promise and apprehension, offering assurance while hinting at loss, a contradiction that weighed heavily on the hearts of those who read. Servants, too, sometimes intercepted fragments of these missives, glimpsing phrases that suggested unease, and sharing them in hushed murmurs along corridors and stairwells. She sleeps more quietly, yes, but she does not laugh, one might whisper. the words trailing into silence, as though acknowledging their impropriety. These observations, transmitted by those closest to the daily routines of the wards, created a quiet network of understanding, an unspoken awareness that the surface calm of the patients masked an interior alteration too profound to be measured solely by obedience or tranquility. The letters often contained precise details of the procedures, the use of ether, the sequence of instruments, the patient's responses during sedation, and the subtle markers observed by attending nurses. They read like logs of scientific endeavor, yet within these details hid an undercurrent of dread. A phrase noting that a child complied without resistance hinted at the erasure of will. An observation that a daughter remained serene concealed the subtle hollows in her expression and the loss of spontaneous thought. Even as the letters reassured, they simultaneously unsettled, conveying both triumph and tragedy in equal measure. Families pored over these documents in the quiet of evening, candlelight flickering across polished tables, the air scented faintly with smoke and perfume. Mothers whispered questions into the soft shadows, fathers nodded grimly, and children looked on with an unease they could not yet articulate. Each letter became both a window and a veil, revealing the results of progress while concealing the full extent of what had been lost. And outside, London breathed under the weight of fog and gaslight, oblivious to the slow, quiet horror that threaded through its hospitals and had begun to infiltrate its homes. By the hour before midnight, the letters lay on desks, folded and refolded, carried in minds anxious, puzzled, and sometimes horrified. Even as society lauded the promise of calm and obedience, these written accounts told a different story, a story of minds reshaped without consent, of personalities diminished under the guise of care, and of the slow, insidious spread of a nightmare carried in ink and paper from the silent wards into the intimate spaces of family life. London, wrapped in fog and candlelight, absorbed these stories unknowingly, each household a witness to transformation, each letter a reminder that the pursuit of progress had begun to exact a cost that could not be measured in mere calmness alone. The city slept uneasily beneath the fog, its gas lamps flickering like watchful eyes over streets that glimmered wet and cold. Within the hospitals, the night watch kept vigil, moving quietly along polished corridors and between silent wards, ears attuned to the faintest stirrings, eyes trained on the pallid forms that lay beneath the soft glow of gaslight. They were observers of transformation, witnesses to the subtle, sometimes imperceptible effects of ether and scalpel on minds that had been entrusted to science. Their reports, written in hushed ink, and often shared only with those in authority, chronicled a quiet terror, invisible to the city beyond. Nurses and attendants patrolled the wards with deliberate care. Their steps were measured, their hands steady on the edges of beds or the soft fabric of blankets, while their eyes roved over faces that were once familiar, but now carried an unsettling serenity. Patients stirred occasionally, murmuring faintly, fluttering lids against the gaslit glow, or moving with a mechanical precision that betrayed the removal of spontaneous will. The night watchers recorded these moments with meticulous attention. The subtle delay in a response, the repetition of a gesture, the absence of fear, laughter, or curiosity. In each observation, the calm of the patient was both celebrated and feared, for it carried the unmistakable weight of erasure beneath its polished surface. Reports were filed with careful detachment, yet even the most composed observers could not entirely mask unease. Patient remains quiet, compliant. Eyelids flutter briefly at the sound of voices, one entry read. Another noted, no response to familiar objects. Hands remain folded, expression neutral. These accounts, clinical in tone, concealed the horror they implied. The quiet obedience of the wards was not a triumph of healing, but a testament to the subtle power of ether and incision over thought, personality, and autonomy. Night watchers understood that the calm they documented was the echo of something deeper, a hushed erasure of what had once been fully human. Outside the wards, the hospital corridors were equally tense, though outwardly empty. The fog that pressed against windows carried the faint sweetness of ether into the city streets, mingling with the smoke of chimneys and the damp of cobblestone. Servants whispered to one another as they moved trays, adjusted pillows, or monitored the flow of sedative vapors, their voices low, cautious, aware that they were complicit in a spectacle whose consequences could not be openly acknowledged. Even as the city slumbered, the night watcher's eyes remained sharp, observing, recording, and anticipating the next subtle shift in demeanor or consciousness. By the hour before dawn, the wards exhaled a stillness heavy with the residue of human transformation. The night watch had noted every subtle flutter of an eyelid, every mechanical gesture, every faint, incoherent murmur. Their reports, tucked away in ledgers and files, would inform the next day's procedures, guide the surgeon's confidence, and provide a quiet record of both success and unintended consequence. Yet for those tasked with observing, the eerie calm carried its own lesson, that the city's pursuit of order and refinement had reached beyond the bounds of consent, altering minds in ways invisible to the waking streets. London, wrapped in fog and gaslight, remained unaware of the subtle terror within. The night watchers, however, carried the knowledge in their eyes and ink, a quiet vigilance over the wards that recorded what polite society refused to see. In the shadows of the theatres, beneath the soft lamplight, the nightmare of lobotomy spread further, measured in the silent obedience of patients, and chronicled in the meticulous, tremulous notes of those who saw what the rest of the city could not. The gas lamps flickered against the high walls of London's hospitals, casting elongated shadows that stretched like fingers across the polished floors. Within these silent corridors, the question of ethics had begun to falter, retreating beneath the weight of ambition, social expectation, and the quiet authority of the surgeons. The men who once debated the moral limits of intervention now moved with measured confidence, their hands steady, their eyes sharp. Yet beneath the composure lay an unspoken acknowledgement. The procedures they performed, lauded as miracles, were irreversible, and the cost, though rarely articulated, was steep. Families had entrusted their loved ones to the hospitals with faith in medicine and progress. Mothers had clutched hands, whispered prayers, and signed forms they scarcely read, hoping that the restlessness, melancholy, or eccentricity of their children, spouses, or wards could be excised by science. Fathers, confident in the authority of the surgeons, assented silently, trusting in the skill that promised both calm and conformity. Yet even as the procedures were conducted with meticulous precision, a tension pervaded the air, the awareness that what was deemed beneficial might, in reality, erase the very essence of the individual. Ethical concerns, once debated in lecture halls and journals, had quietly retreated from practice, displaced by a relentless focus on order, calm, and apparent success. In the operating theatres, ether curled through the air, dulled consciousness, and rendered patients pliable to the hands of authority. Instruments gleamed under gaslight scalpels, trephines, and ivory-handled probes, tools designed with meticulous care, yet wielded upon the unformed terrain of the human mind. Nurses and attendants moved with silent efficiency, their glances catching the slightest signs of resistance or discomfort, their voices low, measured. Each incision, each adjustment, each carefully calculated exposure to ether carried the weight of irreversible consequence. And yet the surgeons proceeded with unwavering assurance, bolstered by the apparent compliance of their subjects and the quiet nods of approval from families who saw only calmness and obedience. The retreat of ethics was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet its presence was felt in every corner of the wards. Where once deliberation had tempered ambition, now protocol and expectation dictated action. Discussions of consent, individuality, and long-term consequence were quietly folded into footnotes, buried beneath observations of calm behavior and clinical efficacy. The very language of the journals reflected this retreat. Compliance replaced, loss of self, tranquility obscured, emptiness, and success masked the quiet hollows that spread like mist through each patient's mind. Even the servants and nurses, acutely aware of the changes wrought upon their charges, deferred to authority, recording observations with precision yet speaking only in whispers when outside the theatre. Beyond the hospital walls, London moved unaware beneath fog and gaslight. Streets pulsed with commerce, the hum of carriage wheels, and the clatter of market activity. Yet within the households and parlours, quiet apprehension began to take root. Families, observing the calmness of those returned from the wards, could sense, without fully articulating, that something essential had been subdued. Conversations were careful, admiration mingled with unease, and the pervasive sense that the city itself had begun to condone a subtle erasure of identity lingered in the shadows. By the late hours of night, when the wards exhaled in silence and the lamps flickered low, the absence of ethical debate weighed heavily in the theatre. London's hospitals had become theatres of authority unchallenged, where ambition and skill eclipsed moral hesitation, and where the quiet retreat of conscience allowed the nightmare of lobotomy to unfold, patient by patient, bed by bed. In the heart of the city, the surgeons moved through their wards with an air of quiet triumph, their white coats gleaming beneath the wavering light of gas lamps, each step measured, deliberate, and imbued with the authority of knowledge. In their eyes was the reflection of meticulous hours spent studying anatomy, practicing technique, and perfecting the art of intervention upon the most delicate organ, the mind itself. The city outside continued its rhythm, oblivious to the transformations occurring within these walls, yet the surgeons carried with them the unmistakable pride of those who believed themselves arbiters of thought, architects of compliance, and masters of disorder. In the theatres, instruments were arranged with precise geometric care, scalpels aligned with trephines, probes rested in ivory cradles, and the faintly sweet scent of ether hung in the air like a promise. Patients, sedated and pliant, lay with limbs relaxed, eyes half-lidded, breaths slow and even. Each measured movement, each incision, and each adjustment was a testament to the skill, diligence, and confidence of the surgeons. Where once hesitation might have tempered their hands, now certainty guided them, the quiet assurance of competence reinforced by the visible effects on the patients, calm, obedient, and, to the trained eye, properly subdued. Their pride extended beyond mere technical mastery. The surgeons were keenly aware of their influence over families, their reputation, and the society that lauded them. Letters from relatives arrived, extolling the apparent success of the procedure, children rendered compliant, adults calm, and households seemingly restored to order. These missives, written with gratitude and admiration, were displayed in offices and read aloud during conferences, bolstering the surgeons' belief in the righteousness of their work. Journals chronicled their successes with meticulous detail, each case described with antiseptic precision and clinical detachment, creating a narrative of triumph that validated both ambition and methodology. Yet, even as they reveled in accomplishment, subtle tensions lingered. Nurses and attendants, silent witnesses to the hollowed expressions and vacant eyes, provided quiet reminders that calm could be both a gift and a theft. Patients who had once laughed, protested, or expressed curiosity now moved in mechanical harmony with their surroundings. The surgeons observed this compliance with a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. Each sign of obedience confirmed skill, yet each hollow gaze whispered of an essential vitality removed. It was an unease rarely spoken aloud, concealed beneath the veneer of confidence and authority, acknowledged only in fleeting glances or subtle shifts in posture. The city, swathed in fog and flickering lamplight, was unaware of the full implications of the surgeon's pride. Families returned home with reports of calm children and compliant relatives, interpreting obedience as evidence of progress, refinement, and the triumph of intellect. In parlors, over tea and the polite murmur of conversation, praise for the surgeons mingled with faint, unspoken apprehension. Even the servants, who observed quietly and knew too well the subtleties of human transformation, were powerless to challenge the public perception of achievement. By night, the wards exhaled a heavy, unnatural stillness. Patients lay in silence, obedient and quiet, while the surgeons, in offices lined with journals and letters of commendation, reflected upon their work with the satisfaction of men convinced of their moral and scientific authority. Yet beneath the pride, there remained an unacknowledged truth. The calm they so admired had come at a price. The essence of individuality, the spark of spontaneity, and the vibrant pulse of personality had been subdued, smoothed, or erased entirely. And though the city slept beneath its fog and gaslight, London itself was slowly absorbing the consequences, unaware that the surgeon's triumph was inseparable from a quiet, creeping nightmare that now threaded itself through the heart of the metropolis. The wards of London's hospitals had grown quiet in a way that no family or visitor could have anticipated. Beds lined the floors in precise rows, each occupied by a figure whose eyes held a vacant, uncomprehending stare. Yet among these still forms, some patients were no longer present in the sense that mattered most, the essence that had once defined them, their thoughts, their desires. Their spark of individuality had quietly vanished, leaving behind only obedience, compliance, and a hollow shell. They were present in body but absent in spirit, and the nurses and attendants who moved among them could only bear witness to the unsettling reality of what had been wrought under the flickering gaslight. Families arriving to see their loved ones were often the first to notice the subtle and sometimes startling changes. A daughter, once spirited and lively, might sit quietly, unmoved by conversation or the presence of those she had once adored. A son, previously prone to bursts of stubborn defiance, would now comply without hesitation. Yet his eyes betrayed an emptiness, a quiet absence that could not be explained by calm alone. Some patients who had been considered troublesome, anxious, or erratic now seemed to have disappeared entirely, their former selves replaced by a carefully constructed silence imposed by the surgeon's hands and the pervasive influence of ether. Mothers wept silently at the bedside, fathers stiffened in disbelief, and attendants moved with a measured pace, acutely aware that the city beyond the hospital walls would never grasp the scale of what had been lost. Even within the hospitals, the phenomenon of disappearance was acknowledged only in whispers and carefully recorded notes. Nurses wrote in ledgers describing patients as compliant, calm, or responsive to instruction, yet the subtext was clear to those who understood the ward's rhythms. Something essential had been erased. Observers recorded the absence of initiative, the lack of curiosity, and the flattened emotional responses that had replaced the vibrant personalities of days past. The instruments, the scalpels, trephines, and probes gleamed silently under gaslight, a reminder of both the technical precision and the chilling authority that had facilitated such transformations. Ether, lingering sweetly in the air, was both a tool and a veil, dulling awareness while masking the depth of what had been removed. Outside the wards, the fog-laden streets of London carried whispers of these disappearances, though seldom in precise terms. Servants spoke quietly in kitchens and back passages, noting the strange behavior of children and adults returning from hospitals, calm, compliant, and, in a way that could not be quantified, absent. Rumors spread in hushed tones among acquaintances and in drawing rooms, interpreted as curiosity, fascination, or polite gossip. But for those who had witnessed the wards firsthand, the truth was undeniable. Progress had exacted a price, and the cost was a quiet erasure of the self. By the deep hours of the night, when the lamps dimmed and the city beyond fell silent beneath fog and mist, the wards exhaled a stillness that was almost unnatural. Patients who had disappeared in mind and spirit rested in mechanical obedience, their breathing the only reminder of life, and the attendants moved among them with the knowledge of quiet complicity. London, outside its hospitals, slumbered unaware, yet the disappearance of so many minds left a subtle trace, a shadow that would linger in the families, households, and streets alike. The city had begun to absorb the consequences of ambition unchecked, a creeping terror measured not in cries or noise, but in the silent absence of those who had once been fully themselves. The wards of London's hospitals seemed to exist in a world apart, a realm of pale lamplight, polished floors, and lingering ether that carried both relief and menace. The beds, arranged with rigid precision, were occupied by patients whose forms betrayed little of the minds that had once animated them. Shadows clung to every corner, stretching across walls and ceilings, cast by the wavering glow of gas lamps and reflected in the vacant eyes of those who had been subdued. These were not merely patients, they were echoes, hushed remnants of what had once been vibrant thought and individuality, now obscured beneath the meticulous calm imposed by surgeons' hands. The air in the wards was thick with the faint sweetness of ether, mingled with the subtle tang of antiseptic. Nurses moved softly between the beds, adjusting linens, checking pulses, and monitoring the gentle rise and fall of chests that had surrendered to sedation. Each movement was performed with mechanical care, a choreography learned through repetition and necessity. Yet even as the staff attended to their duties with quiet efficiency, they could not ignore the shadows that hung over the rooms. Shadows cast not only by lamps but by the hollowness that had begun to permeate the minds of patients. A hand that once fidgeted in nervous anticipation now rested limp, a foot that had tapped restlessly remained still, and eyes that had darted with curiosity now gazed blankly at ceilings or walls. Families who entered the wards were immediately struck by the transformation. Mothers hesitated at the door, fingers clutching lace handkerchiefs, trying to discern recognition in faces that returned only emptiness. Fathers, standing stiff-backed, observed the mechanical obedience, wondering whether the calm they sought had been achieved or at what cost. Children, if present, looked upon the stillness with unease, sensing the absence of spontaneity that had once defined both play and conversation. Conversations were muted, polite, punctuated by soft reassurances. But even as families celebrated obedience and tranquility, an underlying disquiet threaded through their observations, a quiet acknowledgement that something essential had been altered. Within the shadows of the wards, whispers circulated among the staff. Nurses exchanged furtive glances when a patient's eyes remained fixed and unseeing, when a hand moved without intent, or when a faint murmur passed from lips without meaning. The attendants, whose duty required vigilance yet demanded discretion, bore witness to the quiet erosion of identity, noting patterns and anomalies in hushed tones. These observations were carefully recorded in ledgers, clinical and detached, yet the reality they described was deeply unsettling. The wards, filled with compliant patients, had become theaters of subtle, pervasive loss, where obedience was achieved at the expense of mind and spirit. Outside the hospitals, London moved through its fog and gaslight, unaware of the quiet horror that had taken root within. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones, vendors called softly from street corners, and the ordinary rhythm of commerce and life persisted. Yet within the wards, the shadows remained silent, patient, and immovable. They stretched across faces, beds, and corridors, a testament to the transformations wrought in the name of progress. In every vacant gaze, in every mechanically folded hand, in every subdued gesture, the city's inhabitants bore witness to the consequences of ambition unchecked, a quiet terror that seeped through gaslight and fog, threading its way into the very heart of London's hospitals. The quiet calm that pervaded the wards of London's hospitals carried with it a subtle yet insidious weight. Families arrived in the early hours, drawn by hope, duty, or obligation, and left hours later with the uneasy understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Children who had once laughed freely now sat still, their eyes vacant, hands folded precisely in their laps. Spouses moved through parlors and corridors with a measured compliance that, while superficially admirable, betrayed the quiet absence of personality. These transformations, wrought in the name of science and refinement, fractured households in ways too subtle for polite discussion, yet too profound to ignore. Mothers, with lace gloves clasped tightly in their hands, often lingered at the bedside, observing every micro-expression, every small twitch, every delayed response. They whispered prayers beneath their breath, unsure if they were offering protection or mourning the loss of individuality they could not yet name. Fathers, shoulders stiffened with the weight of social expectation, observed mechanically, noting the tranquility and obedience of their children or spouses, while wrestling privately with an instinctive dread. Siblings who had accompanied their family members to the hospital returned home unsettled, the faintest echo of recognition missing in those who were expected to be unchanged. The very fabric of domestic life, once governed by the rhythms of personality, argument, and affection, became warped under the subtle influence of the theatres and their instruments. Even within the wards, the fractures were visible. Nurses, trained to maintain composure and adhere to protocol, spoke in hushed tones of the subtle distortions they observed. A child, once vivacious and curious, now content to sit quietly. A mother's voice echoed back with obedience rather than spontaneity. A father's assertiveness softened to measured acquiescence. These observations, recorded meticulously in ledgers, conveyed calmness and compliance. Yet beneath the measured phrasing lay the acknowledgement of a quiet fracture, a division between the person who had entered the theatre and the form that had emerged. The letters sent to families chronicled these transformations with careful ambiguity. They praised progress and compliance, celebrated the absence of anxiety or agitation, yet provided only the faintest recognition of the hollows that had been left behind. Families read these accounts with gratitude, yet they could not entirely suppress the sense of unease that clung to them as they moved through the city. Conversations in parlors became careful exercises in observation. A glance here, a pause there, a hesitation to comment on an altered mannerism that suggested the presence of a changed mind. Even in polite society, subtle fissures began to appear as observers recognized that calm had been imposed at a profound cost. Outside, London carried on, fog pressing against the gaslit streets, commerce continuing in its usual rhythm, and the city unaware of the quiet transformations infiltrating households. Yet in the hearts of families, fractures had begun. Children returned home compliant but hollow, spouses obedient but diminished, and households found themselves negotiating the presence of a form without the full essence that had once resided within it. The silence in parlors, the measured movements, the quiet compliance, all were reminders that progress had exacted a cost, leaving behind not only calm but a subtle and pervasive fracture within the family itself. As the night deepened, the gas lamps flickered against the windows, shadows stretching long across parlors and corridors alike. Families, returning to homes under the fog and the weight of quiet contemplation, felt the latent echo of absence, the residual tremor of what had been lost. London slept, oblivious, while the city's households, once unified by the ordinary rhythms of domestic life, carried the subtle fractures wrought by ambition, skill, and the terrifying quiet authority of the hospital's theatres. London, cloaked in fog and the soft glow of gas lamps, seemed outwardly calm to those who traversed its cobbled streets, yet beneath the veneer of civility, a quiet tension threaded through the city. Reports whispered from households to servants' quarters, from alleyways to the corners of drawing rooms, and slowly took shape into a pervasive, unarticulated fear. The wards of the hospitals had already begun their work, rendering patients calm, obedient, and hollow. But the ripple effects extended far beyond polished floors and antiseptic air. Families, servants, and acquaintances alike felt the unease pressing against their consciousness, a subtle awareness that the city itself had become witness to a transformation both marveled at and dreaded. The fear was not loud, it did not announce itself with clamor or overt panic. It emerged in the careful glances of parents toward children who moved with mechanical precision, in the way spouses noted that laughter had grown quieter, and in the whispered conversations of servants who had seen too much. Children returned from hospitals altered in subtle but unmistakable ways, their curiosity dampened, spontaneity stilled, and expressions flattened under the meticulous influence of ether and steel. Mothers observed, hearts heavy, as the innocence of youth seemed to slip quietly from their wards. Fathers noted the orderly obedience of grown children or relatives, and yet all felt a tension that words could not convey, a knowledge that the calm achieved had cost far more than civility or composure. In parlors and drawing rooms, polite society wrestled with these transformations. Conversations praised progress, celebrated the eradication of anxiety or agitation, and marveled at the efficiency of medical practice, yet unease lingered beneath the surface. Gentlemen spoke in measured tones of compliance restored, while ladies noted subtle absences in personality or spirit. Servants, moving between households, carried stories of the vacant eyes, the quiet movements, and the absence of spontaneity, repeating them only in hushed whispers to avoid scandal. Rumors, half observed and half constructed, swirled among the city's populace, feeding the fear that the mind itself was no longer fully secure beneath the authority of surgeons and the pervasive influence of ether. Even the hospitals themselves seemed aware of the tremors of apprehension. Night watch nurses recorded faint murmurs, subtle twitches, and blank stares with meticulous care, while attending surgeons continued their work with a calm authority that masked both pride and unease. The wards exhaled with a stillness that was unnatural, almost oppressive, and the shadows stretched long along polished floors, reflecting the hollowness that had been imposed upon so many. Visitors, families, and attendants alike began to sense that the city outside, for all its bustling commerce and fog-laden streets, had become a place in which the ordinary rhythm of life now contained an undercurrent of fear, an awareness that progress could intrude upon identity, autonomy, and the very spark of human consciousness. By night, as the lamps flickered low and the fog pressed against the windows of households and hospitals alike, the quiet fear had become almost tangible. London slept under its heavy blanket, unaware of the magnitude of the transformations that had begun to ripple through its streets and homes. Families lay in uneasy repose, haunted by vacant expressions, measured obedience, and the subtle hollows in the faces of those they loved. The city itself, elegant and dignified by day, had become a theater of apprehension, a place in which progress and terror were inseparable, and where the quiet, pervasive fear of what had been done and what might yet unfold pressured every household, every alleyway, and every shadowed corner of the metropolis. Behind the polished doors of London's hospitals, where gas lamps flickered and the faint sweetness of ether lingered, the surgeons moved with an air of absolute authority. To families, to colleagues, to polite society, they appeared confident, composed, and unerring in their craft. Yet in the private chambers, away from the bright eyes of observers and the anxious gazes of relatives, doubts began to stir. The men who wielded scalpels, trephines, and the pervasive influence of ether were not without conscience. The very precision that allowed them to calm, subdue, and manipulate minds also illuminated the fragility of their triumphs, and the subtle terror of what they had wrought weighed heavily upon them. These doubts were quiet at first, fleeting, easily suppressed beneath the veneer of competence and the applause of society. In the solitude of offices lined with journals and ledgers, Surgeons recorded cases with meticulous attention to detail, noting compliance, tranquility, and apparent improvement. Yet even as ink flowed onto paper, their minds wrestled with what the statistics could not capture: the absence in vacant eyes, the hollow gestures, the faint whispers of memory or personality that no longer reached the surface. In hushed moments, away from assistants and nurses, they admitted to themselves that the calm they celebrated had been purchased at the expense of individuality, spontaneity, and the natural spark of the human mind. The nurses and attendants, aware of these unspoken tensions, offered subtle reminders. They spoke softly of flickers of expression that passed too quickly to be measured, of murmurs that carried remnants of thought or emotion, of the faint, almost imperceptible ways in which patients resisted even under sedation. These observations, though careful and restrained, pressed upon the surgeon's conscience, offering glimpses of the limits of control, the boundaries of science, and the inherent unpredictability of human thought. In private, surgeons pondered the ethical ramifications, questioning whether obedience without understanding could truly be considered relief, and whether calm could ever justify the quiet erasure of mind. Outside the chambers, the city continued beneath its blanket of fog and gaslight, oblivious to the internal deliberations. Families spoke of tranquility restored, children obedient, and adults subdued. Society praised the authority of science, yet remained largely unaware of the shadows that lingered behind the polished facades of hospitals. Within the theaters, instruments gleamed and ether lingered, and the wards remained silent and orderly. And yet, in private offices and solitary corridors, the quiet doubts persisted, a soft hum beneath the confident rhythm of procedure. These private hesitations were seldom voiced aloud. To speak of them risked undermining authority, eroding public trust, or calling into question the very foundations of the procedures themselves. Instead, they existed as undercurrents, shaping decisions in subtle ways. A slightly slower incision, a more cautious application of ether, a brief pause to observe a reaction that might have been overlooked. Even these small concessions, however, did little to diminish the weight of uncertainty, for the surgeons understood, with uneasy clarity, that mastery over the mind was never absolute, and that the calm imposed upon their patients was fragile, contingent, and, in ways they could not fully reconcile, potentially destructive. By night, as the wards exhaled in unnatural stillness and the city beyond lay shrouded in fog, the surgeons remained in their chambers, quills poised above ledgers, pondering the consequences of their own skill. The public perceived mastery, families observed obedience, yet the men themselves carried the quiet knowledge of what had been lost, the vibrant pulse of individuality, the unpredictable spark of thought, and the profound mystery of mind rendered silent under the glow of gaslight and the pervasive sweetness of ether. The newspapers arrived each morning, folded and pressed, with the meticulous care of a society that valued appearances above all. Headlines, printed in bold serif type, extolled the virtues of modern medicine, chronicled the triumphs of London's surgeons, and assured families that disorder, anxiety, and unrest had been conquered with skill and precision. Yet beneath the polished reports and the carefully measured prose, the first hints of unease began to emerge. Editors, cautious yet compelled by public curiosity, allowed subtle critiques, carefully framed, to appear amidst the praise. Murmurs of unusual patient behavior, faint observations of vacant expressions, and the occasional footnote acknowledging complications that had been minimized or omitted entirely in official reports. Families read these accounts with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Mothers sipped tea and whispered questions into lace-gloved hands, their eyes darting to the children at their sides, seeking reassurance or recognition. Fathers leaned over the pages, scanning clinical descriptions of instruments, ether, and procedure, noting the words compliance and tranquility, with both pride and trepidation. Even as the press presented progress, society began to perceive the subtle shadow behind it. The calm achieved within the wards often carried an air of artificiality, a quiet hollowness that no headline could fully convey. Within the hospitals, the critical press sparked a strange tension. Surgeons continued their work with measured precision, aware that the eyes of readers, families, and professional peers were now quietly scrutinizing each outcome. The instruments gleamed under the flickering gaslight, ether lingered sweetly in the air, and the wards maintained their orderly calm. Yet in private corridors, discussions became more deliberate, observations more meticulous. Nurses and attendants spoke in whispers of subtle deviations, patients whose eyes seemed unfocused, children whose curiosity had been dampened, adults whose compliance bordered on vacuity. The press had begun to articulate what many had sensed but had not dared to voice: the quiet, pervasive cost of scientific triumph. Letters to editors appeared with polite concern, voicing questions about the ethical limits of intervention, the possible consequences of erasing anxiety through procedure, and the long-term effects on personality and memory. These were tempered with admiration for medical innovation, but the undertone was unmistakable. Society's curiosity was giving way to unease, and even the most confident assertions of progress could not entirely silence the recognition of cost. Families, servants, and observers alike read these letters, passing cautious commentary in drawing rooms, parlors, and alleyways. The fog-bound streets outside carried these whispers, merging the anxieties of private households with the public scrutiny slowly encroaching upon the hospitals. By night, the wards exhaled in their familiar calm, the patients' vacant eyes reflecting the dim glow of gas lamps. Yet outside, in the flickering lamplight and the damp alleys of London, a different story unfolded. The press, subtle yet insistent, had begun to illuminate the shadows that had always existed alongside the promise of obedience and tranquility. Surgeons, while outwardly unshaken, could not ignore the murmurs of critique, the faint but persistent questions regarding the ethical and human costs of their work. Families, servants, and city observers began to perceive that progress, however elegant, came with consequences that could no longer be entirely hidden. The city, shrouded in fog and gaslight, listened. London's streets hummed with the ordinary rhythm of commerce and life, yet beneath it all, the pulse of concern had quickened. The press, once a chronicler of triumph, had begun to hint at the quiet terror underlying the wards, the hollowness of compliance, the subtle erasure of personality, and the creeping realization that the calm the city admired had been purchased at the cost of something far more precious and irrevocable. Even in the most meticulously ordered wards, accidents whispered their presence like a faint, persistent wind through the corridors. London's hospitals, gleaming under the tremulous glow of gas lamps, had become theatres of both skill and subtle peril. The instruments, polished and arranged with the utmost precision, awaited the surgeon's hands, gleaming with promise and menace alike. Yet no amount of care could fully contain the unpredictability of the human mind, nor the fragile chemical haze of ether that dulled resistance and rendered bodies pliable. Within this environment of apparent calm, miscalculations occurred, quietly, imperceptibly at first, and then with consequences that could not be easily contained. Surgeons, confident in their abilities and reassured by meticulous journals, occasionally faltered in their calculations, misjudged depth or angle, or underestimated a patient's reaction to sedation. A scalpel, held with the surety of years of practice, might slip slightly, or a probe could pierce a trajectory that was unintended. These errors, though subtle, often resulted in outcomes that were irreversible, producing hollowed expressions, muted speech, or sudden fainting, leaving the patient altered in ways that could not be predicted or fully understood. Nurses and attendants observed these incidents with a mixture of anxiety and silent resignation, recording them in ledgers with clinical detachment, yet their eyes betrayed the apprehension that lingered in the presence of lives disrupted. Ether itself was a capricious ally. Its sweet scent, so carefully measured and administered, carried with it both sedative power and the potential for danger. Too little, and a patient might struggle against the procedure, eyes flicking, limbs twitching, rendering the theater tense with uncertainty. Too much, and consciousness could be suppressed beyond intended limits, leaving a body inert yet unresponsive, a mind silenced in ways that no journal could quantify. Even the most experienced attendants approached its administration with caution, aware that the line between calm and catastrophe was finer than the edge of the surgeon's instruments. Families waiting in corridors or parlors sometimes glimpsed the consequences of these miscalculations. A mother might observe a child returned with movements slower than before, eyes that seemed dimmed, or expressions that lacked recognition. Fathers might note a subtle stiffness, a quiet obedience that went beyond compliance, and whisper to one another in uneasy tones. The hospital's reputation and the authority of the surgeons concealed much, yet the city's residents were perceptive, and rumors of accidents of patients altered beyond intent spread quietly through parlors, servant quarters, and the alleyways between houses. Even in public, the rare report of accidents stirred fascination tinged with apprehension. Editors published accounts with careful wording, noting that a procedure had been completed successfully with minor deviations, or that a patient experienced unforeseen reactions under sedation. But rarely did the reports convey the true scope of harm. The hollows carved into thought, the subtle erasure of spontaneity, the faint, irretrievable loss of individuality. And yet, within the wards themselves, the staff were acutely aware. Even perfection in procedure could not fully restrain the unpredictability of ether, blade, or human response. By nightfall, as gas lamps dimmed and the fog pressed against the hospital windows, the wards exhaled their heavy, unnatural calm. Patients rested, obedient, and still, yet the echoes of miscalculations lingered in vacant eyes and hollowed expressions. Surgeons, though outwardly composed, were reminded in these moments of their fallibility, of the delicate balance between mastery and catastrophe, and of the subtle, creeping horror that accompanied every error. London slept outside, unaware of the quiet consequences unfolding within. But within the hospital walls, the shadow of accidents and miscalculations stretched long, insidious, and impossible to ignore. By the mid-morning hours, the first tremors of dissent began to ripple through London. What had once been whispered, rumors now gathered voice in parlors, drawing rooms, and the quiet corners of coffee houses. Families, servants, and even some junior physicians began to speak openly of what had been observed behind hospital doors. The vacant eyes, the hollowed gestures, the subtle erasure of personality. The city, long enamored with the promise of scientific progress and the allure of obedience, began to register a disquiet that could no longer be contained beneath the polite veneer of praise. Conversations carried cautious urgency, curiosity entwined with fear, and slowly, a public consciousness began to coalesce around the unsettling reality of the lobotomy. Letters to editors appeared with increasing frequency, penned in careful hand or pressed type, detailing personal experiences and raising questions of morality and ethics. A mother described her daughter's return from the wards, once restless and opinionated, now silent and compliant, her personality dulled to the point of near absence. A father recounted his son's transformation from a spirited, questioning boy into a quiet, obedient shadow of himself. These accounts, though tempered with the politeness expected in print, carried an unmistakable undercurrent of alarm. Readers across the city began to recognize that the marvels heralded in the newspapers, the calm, the compliance, the promise of restored order might conceal profound, irreversible costs. The debate spilled into society's salons and drawing rooms. Ladies exchanged observations with soft, trembling voices, speaking of children whose curiosity had been stilled, of spouses rendered compliant yet hollow. Gentlemen nodded, acknowledging the efficacy of the procedures, but the pause before their agreement betrayed the subtle apprehension that threaded through the conversations. Questions began to emerge. At what cost did obedience arrive? How much of the person had been sacrificed for calm? And who, ultimately, held responsibility for the quiet destruction of mind and spirit? Even as these questions were phrased delicately, the undertone of fear was unmistakable, and the polished veneer of high society began to show cracks. Servants, often the most perceptive witnesses, carried their own testimony into public spaces, though cautiously. In hushed tones, they described patients who no longer resisted or questioned, who moved with an unnatural stillness, and whose voices, when they spoke at all, were monotone and stripped of inflection. These accounts, exchanged among the working population, added weight to the sense of public unease. Tales of altered minds and silent compliance seeped into the broader consciousness of the city, amplifying apprehension and transforming curiosity into fear. The ether-laden theaters, once the domain of scientific authority, were no longer invisible. Their consequences were threading into households, streets, and conversations throughout London. By evening, gatherings outside hospitals and in salons reflected the growing public outcry. Demonstrations of concern were subtle at first, murmurs in corridors, questions asked in polite tone, letters penned to authorities. Yet the underlying message was unmistakable. The calm achieved in the wards could no longer be celebrated uncritically. For the cost of that calm, the erasure of mind, the hollowing of personality had begun to demand attention. Even as the gas lamps flickered low, casting long shadows over the fog-bound streets, London itself seemed to sense a shift. The city, long entranced by the authority of science and the promise of progress, now stirred with the first true awareness of the quiet, pervasive horror unfolding within its hospitals, a collective unease that would not soon be dismissed. Long after the last lamp in the hospital had flickered low and the fog pressed thick against the streets of London, the wards exhaled a silence that was heavy, unnatural, and suffused with the echoes of what had been lost. Patients remained still, their movements precise, their breaths even and measured. Yet the spark of individuality, the restless curiosity, the laughter, the impulsive gestures that had once defined them had been subdued, muted, or entirely erased. This legacy of silence was not only the absence of sound, but the quiet imposition of order over thought, the hushed, insidious erasure of mind that left obedience in its place. Families returned to houses that seemed familiar yet subtly transformed, the invisible weight of altered minds settling over rooms and hallways like the fog that clung to the city. Mothers moved among the children and spouses who had been brought to the hospitals, their hands tentative, fingers brushing locks of hair or shoulders in search of recognition. Fathers observed with quiet consternation, noting the calm that had been achieved, yet sensing the hollowness beneath, the absence of spontaneity and personality that no amount of reassurance could conceal. Children who had once laughed, argued, or explored with relentless curiosity now moved through rooms with mechanical precision, their behavior molded to expectation rather than guided by instinct. Conversations, once lively, became measured, polite, and subdued, a reflection of the alteration imposed upon those who had passed through the surgeon's hands. Servants, ever perceptive and quietly observant, carried the legacy of silence in their own awareness. They had witnessed the transformation firsthand, the vacant eyes, the monotone speech, the mechanical gestures, and knew that what was outwardly calm had been purchased at a profound cost. In hushed whispers within kitchens, corridors, and servant quarters, they recounted the subtle signs of alteration, the faint hesitations that no longer arose, the playful mischief that had vanished, the questions left unasked. These observations, though seldom shared beyond their circle, formed a quiet record of what the official reports and journals rarely acknowledged, that the cost of obedience and calm was a diminution of thought, personality, and spirit. In the city beyond the hospital walls, London's streets carried a different form of quiet, one that resonated with the ripple effects of altered minds. Gas lamps flickered against cobblestones slick with fog, shadows stretching long and cold. Conversations in parlours, coffee houses, and alleys reflected a subtle tension, a collective unease born from encounters with those recently returned from the wards. The legacy of silence was not only contained within the hospitals, it had begun to permeate households, shaping expectations, decorum, and behavior. A child's obedience became a measure of success. A spouse's compliance was praised. Curiosity, spontaneity, and dissent were quietly diminished, observed yet rarely challenged. By night, as the fog pressed thick against the city, the hospitals exhaled their persistent, unnatural calm. Surgeons, confident in their methods, continued their work with pride, yet even they could sense the subtle, enduring consequences. That calm achieved in this way was not relief, but control, not restoration, but subtraction. Families lived alongside the quiet echo of what had been taken, the altered minds and subdued spirits forming a legacy that would stretch far beyond the wards, permeating London's streets, parlours, and alleyways. The city, wrapped in gaslight and mist, had absorbed the quiet horror of progress, and the legacy of silence lingered, palpable in every vacant gaze, every subdued movement, and every measured, polite word, a testament to ambition's cost, invisible yet impossible to ignore. Even as London celebrated the triumphs of modern medicine, the wards of its hospitals whispered a different truth. Gas lamps flickered across polished floors, casting long shadows over beds where patients lay obedient, quiet, and altered, yet the veneer of calm could not conceal the subtle fractures beneath. Surgeons, armed with scalpels, trephines, and the sweet, pervasive ether, had mastered technique and command, but the human mind remained a terrain of unpredictable depth. Despite their skill and authority, science had encountered a boundary beyond which certainty could not extend, a limit that even the most confident hands could not fully navigate. Within the operating theatres, surgeons continued to work with measured precision. Instruments gleamed, ether hung in the air, and nurses attended with unerring diligence. Yet even in these controlled environments, anomalies occurred. Some patients resisted subtly, their reactions faint but undeniable. Others, sedated to apparent compliance, displayed irregularities only observable through careful attention to minute detail. Surgeons noted these inconsistencies, adjusting angles, depths, and dosage with meticulous care. But each small variation was a reminder that mastery over the mind was tentative, provisional, and never absolute. The very unpredictability of thought, memory, and personality imposed boundaries that no scalpel or chemical could fully overcome. The journals, polished and antiseptic, recorded successes with careful pride, yet beneath the clinical language lay acknowledgments of limits, footnotes describing complications, faint references to behavioral anomalies, and occasional remarks hinting at outcomes that were neither predictable nor fully understood. Surgeons wrote of compliance achieved, anxiety subdued, and agitation erased, yet they also noted that the human spirit, in its complexity, could not always be neatly constrained. Minds that had been manipulated returned with fragments of resistance, flickers of emotion, or unexpected cognitive shifts, reminders that even the most thorough procedure could not guarantee the restoration or destruction of thought with complete predictability. Families, observing their children, spouses, or wards, perceived only the surface calm, unaware of the fragile balance maintained within. Mothers noted obedience, fathers observed tranquility, and servants watched closely, whispering among themselves of subtle irregularities that hinted at the impermanence of the achieved control. The city beyond the hospitals moved with its usual rhythm. Carriages rattled over wet cobblestones, merchants called from fogged street corners. But the wards told a quieter story, that of a human mind altered, subdued, and yet not fully mastered, a reminder that even science, for all its authority and ambition, had boundaries imposed by the very complexity it sought to regulate. By nightfall, as the gas lamps dimmed and shadows lengthened, surgeons retired to their offices with journals in hand, reflecting upon the day's successes and anomalies alike. Patients lay calm and compliant, yet within that obedience were signs of a profound uncertainty. London slept, fog pressing against windows, oblivious to the subtle tremors of limitation reverberating through its hospitals. Science, for all its pride, had met the inherent unpredictability of mind, a boundary neither anticipated nor fully accounted for. The calm, the obedience, and the compliance achieved within the wards were remarkable, yet they existed alongside the quiet acknowledgement of what could not be controlled, the enduring, unknowable essence of thought, spirit, and individuality that even the most skilled surgeon could not fully command. By the time the gas lamps of London had dimmed to a soft, flickering glow, the city lay under its familiar shroud of fog, streets slick with damp, and the faint echo of carriage wheels. Yet beneath the veneer of civility, beneath the patter of commerce and the polite rhythms of daily life, an unseen terror had taken root, woven invisibly into the very fabric of the metropolis. London, so often proud of its advancements, its refinement, and its command of reason, had become the stage upon which a quiet, pervasive nightmare unfolded, one born of ambition, precision, and the unrelenting authority of science. Within the hospitals, the wards exhaled an unnatural calm. Patients lay in mechanical obedience, their hands folded, their breathing even, their eyes vacant yet alert to the slightest prompt. Children, once restless and spirited, sat unmoving, curiosity stilled. Adults, previously argumentative or anxious, moved with deliberate precision, words muted, gestures softened to the point of near absence. The effect was subtle yet undeniable. A city's human canvas altered quietly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. The quiet horror was not in screams, nor in blood, but in absence, the erasure of individuality, the smoothing away of personality, and the gentle, insidious replacement of spontaneity with calculated obedience. Families returning from the wards carried the residue of this nightmare into homes, parlors, and alleyways. Mothers observed vacant expressions, tracing fingers across pale hands, hoping for recognition in eyes that no longer reflected memory or spirit. Fathers noted measured gestures, speech stripped of inflection, obedience that felt both miraculous and unnatural. Children, once vivacious, now mirrored the calm imposed upon them. Their play diminished, their energy softened, their curiosity muted. Households that had once thrummed with life and argument now moved with mechanical cadence, each member navigating a world altered in subtle, indelible ways. Even beyond households, the city itself seemed to resonate with this quiet unease. Servants carried stories between homes in whispers, noting the vacant stares of those recently returned from hospitals, the faint mechanical precision of gestures, and the subdued compliance of those once animated by individuality. Newsletters and letters chronicled progress, but rumor and observation whispered truths too unsettling to print. The human mind, subjected to blade and ether, had become a landscape of absence, where obedience and calm masked loss, and where progress had been measured not only in relief but in erasure. Surgeons, proud of their authority and the apparent perfection of procedure, were not entirely oblivious to the shadows of consequence. Behind closed doors, in offices lined with journals and ledgers, they acknowledged, with unease, the limits of mastery and the cost of control. The calm achieved was fragile, measured, and profound, but it was also a reminder that even the most meticulous hand could not fully predict the shape of mind once altered, nor the enduring hollows that lingered after compliance was imposed. As night deepened and fog pressed heavy against windows, London exhaled in uneasy rhythm. Streets glimmered wetly beneath lamplight, and the city slept, unaware of the subtle but pervasive transformations that threaded through households, wards, and alleyways. The nightmare was unseen, yet its presence was undeniable. An entire metropolis reshaped, minds subdued, spirits softened, and the quiet, unrelenting imprint of ambition and science, leaving London altered forever. Progress, once celebrated, had revealed its shadow. The city's human heart was no longer entirely intact, and the fog carried, imperceptibly yet persistently, the echoes of minds rendered silent under the promise of calm, obedience, and the authority of men in white coats.